close your eyes. Breathe in slowly, gently. Let your shoulders fall. Let your hands rest. Let the quiet of this late hour settle around you like a warm blanket on a winter's night. You do not need to be anywhere right now. You do not need to do anything. You need only to listen and let the soft weight of history carry you somewhere far away, somewhere ancient, somewhere still. Tonight, we're going to travel together through one of the oldest and most quietly remarkable stories in the entire history of our species. It is not a story of wars or conquests, not a tale of great battles or dramatic speeches, though those things will appear at the edges of our journey. No, tonight's story is smaller than that, and at the same time infinitely larger. Tonight we follow something you have held in your hands 1,000 times, something you have slipped into your pocket without a second thought, something so ordinary that it has nearly become invisible to you. Tonight we follow the coin, we follow money, the idea of it, the invention of it, the slow, quiet miracle of it. And I want you to understand as you drift towards sleep that what we are exploring tonight is one of the most profound revolutions in all of human history. Not a revolution of armies or ideologies, but a revolution of trust, a revolution of small metal discs and the enormous world-changing promise they carried. So let us begin at the very beginning. Let us go back, far back, before any coins existed, before money existed, before even the idea of money had flickered into being inside the mind of any human anywhere on this ancient earth. Let us go back to a time when the night was darker, when the only light came from fire, and when human life was governed entirely by what you could grow, hunt, make, or carry. Imagine, if you will, a village at the edge of a river somewhere in the ancient Middle East, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. The sun has set. The sky above is enormous and crowded with stars, more stars than you have ever seen, because there is no electric light anywhere in the world to dim them. The air smells of wood smoke and mud and the faint sweetness of barley drying on flat stones. Somewhere in the village a dog barks once, then falls silent. A man, let us call him Enlil, a farmer, broad-shouldered with calloused hands and a sun-darkened face, is sitting by his hearth. He is worried, not terribly worried, not in the way of despair, but with the low, persistent worry of a practical man facing a practical problem. He has too much barley. His harvest this year was good, truly good, and his storage jars are full to overflowing. He has enough barley to feed his family for 2 winters. But what he does not have, what he desperately needs, is new sandals. His old pair have fallen apart on the rough stone paths between his fields, and his feet are cracked and bleeding. He's tried to mend them, but the leather is simply too far gone. There is a sandal maker in the village. His name is and he is very good at his craft. Has a workshop just 3 houses away, and hanging from the beams of that workshop are beautiful sandals, stiff and strong, exactly what Enlil needs. So the next morning, Enlil walks to workshop with a sack of barley over his shoulder. He greets warmly. They speak of the weather, of the river, of the harvest. And then Enlil says, "I would like a pair of sandals. I have excellent barley, 6 measures. Is that enough?" And who is polite and good-natured, but also a man with a family to feed, looks at the barley and then looks at Enlil and says, "I appreciate the offer, my friend, but I have plenty of barley right now. My wife has been trading pottery for barley all season, and we have more than we can use. What I really need is linen. My children have no winter cloaks." And there it is, the ancient frustration, The problem that would take humanity thousands of years to solve, Enlil has something doesn't need. Has something Enlil desperately wants. But there is no exchange possible because the want does not run in both directions at the same time. The economists of our time call this problem the double coincidence of wants. It sounds academic and bloodless, but in lived reality, it was one of the most exhausting, time-consuming, dignity-straining aspects of life in the ancient world. Every single transaction required not one willing party, but two. Two people who each happened to have exactly what the other person needed, at exactly the same moment. Think about how difficult that was. Think about how much time was spent simply searching. How many mornings were wasted walking from neighbour to neighbour asking, "Do you have what I need? And do you need what I have?" The question had to be asked over and over, endlessly, and the answer was almost always, almost, but not quite. Enlil would eventually find someone who had linen and wanted barley, and that person could trade with for sandals. But this required Enlil to carry his barley across the village, or perhaps across several villages, in the heat of the day, conducting a chain of complicated negotiations before he could rest his tired, cracked feet in new sandals. This was trade in the ancient world, and it was exhausting. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings existed in small bands of hunter-gatherers, and trade as we understand it barely existed at all. Within a group, everything was shared: food, tools, knowledge, labour, in a web of reciprocal obligation that was enforced not by law or money, but by community, by the closeness of people who depended on each other every single day. If you helped me drag this deer home from the forest, I owed you something in return. Not measured, not quantified, just understood. A favour, a portion, a turn at the fire. But as human groups grew larger, as we settled into villages and then towns, as we began to specialise, this person grows grain, that one makes pottery, another repairs tools. Those old informal webs of reciprocal obligation began to break down. You cannot feed an entire town on personal favours and shared memories. You cannot run a complex economy on handshakes and goodwill alone. And so, slowly, painfully, incrementally, human beings began to search for solutions. The very first solutions were what historians call commodity money, goods that were so widely useful, so universally valued, that they began to function as a kind of currency, even without being officially designated as such. Grain was one of the earliest. In Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, the cradle of civilization, the place where writing and cities and complex government first emerged, grain became a kind of proto-money. The great temples and palace storehouses of Sumer would accept grain from farmers as payment for taxes and redistributed it as wages to workers. Grain had the enormous advantage of being something everyone needed. If you accepted grain in trade, you knew you could always find a use for it or someone else who wanted it. But grain had problems. It was heavy. It rotted. Mice ate it. It was difficult to divide precisely. A bushel of grain is not a bushel of grain is not a bushel of grain. The quality varied enormously depending on the harvest, the storage, the variety. Was this barley as good as that barley? Disputes were constant and exhausting. Cattle were another ancient form of commodity money. In many ancient cultures, across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, wealth was counted in livestock. The Latin word for money, pecunia, is directly descended from the word pecus, meaning cattle. The English word fee traces back through Germanic languages to a root that meant livestock. Even today, in parts of East Africa, bride wealth and fines and contracts are settled in cattle. Cattle had advantages over grain. They were large and visible, hard to steal quietly, easy to count. They represented a substantial store of value. But they too had profound drawbacks. You cannot make change from a cow. If you need to pay someone half a cow's worth of goods, what do? The answer, in ancient times, was sometimes horrifying to modern sensibilities. Cattle also walked around. They got sick. They died. They required feeding, watering, and care. A herd of cattle was wealth, yes, but it was wealth that demanded constant attention. Shells were perhaps the most widespread of the ancient commodity monies, and they are endlessly fascinating. The cowrie shell, small, smooth, egg-shaped, with a distinctive slit opening that made it look almost like a tiny porcelain eye, was used as currency across an astonishing range of civilizations. Cowries have been found in ancient graves in China, in burial sites across sub-Saharan Africa, in the trading cities of South Asia, in the ancient markets of the Arabian Peninsula. Why cowrie shells? There was something almost magical about them to ancient eyes. They were beautiful, smooth and lustrous, in shades of cream and gold and pale orange. They were durable. Unlike grain, they did not rot. Unlike cloth, they did not fray. They were portable. You could carry hundreds in a small bag. They were countable. No disputes about quality. A cowrie was a cowrie, and they were hard to fake, at least in the inland regions where they were most commonly used as money, since the shells came from specific ocean shores and had to travel great distances before reaching inland markets. Their relative scarcity in inland areas gave them a natural value. In China, cowrie shells were used as money as early as 1200 BCE, possibly earlier. The Chinese character for money and many related financial concepts, buy, sell, goods, trade, wealth, precious, all contain the component representing a cowrie shell. The linguistic fossil is still there, baked into one of the world's oldest written languages, whispering of the days when shells were currency. Beads of glass, stone, and bone were used across many cultures. Salt, precious, necessary, portable, preservative, was used as currency in parts of Africa and across the Roman world. There is a persistent story that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, giving rise to the English word salary, though historians have found this story to be largely a myth. I have explored that in depth in another episode on this channel, if you would like to follow that quiet trail some other sleepless night. Cloth, especially fine woven linen or silk, served as money in many ancient civilizations. Iron bars, copper ingots, bronze tools, all circulated as forms of payment. But all of these commodity monies shared common problems. They were heavy, or perishable, or difficult to divide, or inconsistent in quality, or inconvenient to transport, or all of the above. Each one worked after a fashion in limited contexts for limited communities. None of them could fully solve the problem. None of them, that is, until the day someone, some forgotten genius whose name we will never know, decided to stamp a piece of metal. But before we arrive at that world-changing moment, I want you to stay a little longer in the world before coins. Because it was not simply a world of frustrating trade negotiations. It was a world of remarkable improvisation, of human creativity and ingenuity, of the endless human determination to solve the problem of exchange. In ancient Mesopotamia, the temples were not just religious centers, but also the first great banks. The temples of Ur, of Babylon, of Nippur were enormous storehouses where grain, wool, oil and silver were deposited by farmers and merchants, and redistributed by complex temple bureaucracies. Cuneiform tablets, the clay records of ancient Sumer, pressed with reed styluses and baked hard in the sun, recorded deposits and withdrawals, debts and credits, with extraordinary precision. The world's first written records were not poetry or prayer or history. They were receipts, they were accounts, they were the paperwork of commerce. In those temple storehouses, silver served a particularly important role. Silver was weighed out in units called shekels, a word that has survived 4,000 years to become the name of the modern Israeli currency. Silver did not rot like grain, did not get sick like cattle, did not break like pottery. It was dense and heavy relative to its size, making it difficult to steal in large quantities without being noticed. And it could be melted, purified, and divided with precision. A merchant dealing in silver knew that 1 shekel weighed 1 shekel, regardless of where or when the transaction took place. But this weighed silver was still cumbersome. Every transaction required scales, careful, precise, portable scales. Every exchange began with a ritual of weighing, and the silver itself, rough, irregular lumps of metal, could be adulterated with cheaper metals. How did you know the silver you were receiving was truly pure? You tested it, scratched it against a touchstone, watched the colour of the streak, made your best judgment. It took expertise. It took time. It was better than barley, yes, but it was still far from perfect. The world was waiting for something better. And then, sometime around 650 to 600 BCE, in the kingdom of Lydia in what is now Western Turkey, it came. Let us travel, still in this gentle darkness, to the ancient kingdom of Lydia. If you could visit it now, if you could somehow step through the night and find yourself on the banks of the Pactolus River in the 7th century BCE, you would find yourself in a land of extraordinary beauty and wealth. The Pactolus flows from the peaks of Mount Molus down through a valley of remarkable richness, and in the sands of that river, washing down from the mountain slopes above, there was gold. Not just traces of gold, but quantities of gold significant enough to be regularly harvested by the careful work of local farmers and traders who knew the river's secrets. The Greeks had a myth about this gold. They said it came from King Midas, the king whose touch turned everything to gold, who begged the god Dionysus to reverse the curse, and who was told to wash his hands in the Pactolus. The gold curse flowed out of him into the river, the story said, and that is why Lydian gold was so abundant. The reality was geological rather than mythological, but no less remarkable. The Pactolus carried deposits of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver that formed in the mountain rocks above and was gradually eroded and carried downstream. Electrum is a beautiful metal, warm gold in colour with a slight silvery shimmer, and the Lydians had been working with it for centuries. The Lydian kings were wealthy beyond the dreams of their neighbours. Their capital city, Sardis, was a place of legend, a great city on a fortified hill surrounded by fertile plains, sitting at the intersection of the major trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world to the civilizations of Persia and beyond. And it was in Sardis, or perhaps in the workshops that served the Lydian court, that someone, we do not know exactly who, though the innovation is traditionally associated with the reign of King Aliats, or possibly his famous son Croesus, made the decision that would change the world. They took a piece of electrum, they cut it, or cast it, into a small, rough, bean-shaped lump of a standard weight, and then, using a hardened metal punch, they struck it with the die, impressing into the soft surface of the metal an image, a mark, a seal. The first coins were born. The image on those first Lydian coins was simple, the forepart of a lion, usually with an open mouth, sometimes paired with a bull. These were the symbols of Lydian royal power, the emblems of the king. By stamping them into the metal, the king was making a declaration that would echo through all of subsequent human history. He was saying, I have weighed this, I have tested this, I guarantee it. This is worth what I say it is worth, and you can trust that without testing it yourself, without bringing your scales to every transaction, without negotiating over quality. The king's mark is your assurance. The king's word is your guarantee. This was the revolutionary idea, not the metal, not even the standardized weight, though that mattered. The revolution was the stamp, the guarantee, the notion that a piece of metal could carry impressed into its very surface the authority of a state, a king, a power that would stand behind the claim of value. The early Lydian coins, called hectes meaning sixths, as they were 1/6 of the Lydian stater, the basic unit, were roughly the size of a large bean, heavy for their size, warm golden in colour. They were not perfectly round, they were not precisely flat, but they carried the lion's forepart, and that was enough. The convenience of these coins was immediately obvious to anyone who traded with them. No more scales, no more assaying. You simply counted. You could tell at a glance how many coins you had, and since each coin bore the king's mark, you could trust that each one was worth what it claimed to be worth. And trust, it turns out, was the most valuable thing of all. Croesus, who ruled Lydia around 560 to 547 BCE, is often credited with taking the next great step. Under Croesus, the Lydian mint began producing coins of pure gold and pure silver separately, rather than the mixed electrum that had characterized the earliest coins. This was a significant refinement. Electrum's natural variation in gold to silver content made it difficult to standardize value precisely. By separating the metals, you could guarantee purity as well as weight. Croesus became so famous for his wealth that his name became a proverb. Rich as Croesus, the phrase is still used today, 2,500 years later, though most people who say it have no idea they are invoking the memory of a Lydian king who lived before Socrates was born. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, describes Croesus as the first foreigner he knew of to make offerings at Greek temples, magnificent offerings, rich with gold and silver. Croesus sent to Delphi, to the great oracle, enormous donations, a golden lion sitting on a platform of golden bricks, bowls of gold and silver, statues and ornaments of extraordinary workmanship. He was announcing his wealth to the Greek world, and the announcement was heard. But wealth, as Herodotus also records, was not enough to protect Croesus. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great came west with his armies, Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi about whether he should fight. The oracle told him, famously, that if he crossed the Halys River to attack Persia, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus crossed the river. A great empire was indeed destroyed. It was his own. And so Lydia fell to Persia. But the idea of coins, that extraordinary idea, that revolutionary technology of guaranteed, stamped, portable value, that idea did not fall with Lydia. That idea was picked up by the Persians themselves, and by the Greeks who traded with the Persians, and from them it spread in all directions, carried by merchants and armies and the restless, searching energy of human commerce. Think about what it must have felt like to be among the first people to hold a coin, to hold a small disc of metal, warm in your palm, and to understand, to feel, in your body, in your gut, that this small thing had power. Not just weight, not just metal, but guaranteed value. That somewhere a king had said, "This is real, this counts, this is worth something, and I stake my authority on it." For all of the thousands of years of human trade before this moment, every exchange had been a negotiation, a conversation, a potential argument. Is this grain as good as that grain? Is this copper ingot pure? Is this cloth the right weight? With coins, for the first time, the negotiation was already over before it began. The coin spoke for itself. The coin carried its own authority, quiet and self-contained, in the image pressed into its face. Something profound had shifted in the relationship between human beings and value. Value had become portable. Value had become certain. Value had become, in a deep and fundamental way, trustable. And that trust, that small, fragile, extraordinary act of social faith, would go on to build cities, fund armies, establish empires, create art, and knit the scattered communities of the ancient world into something that was beginning, slowly, to resemble a global economy. While the Lydians were stamping their lion-faced electrum hectes on the shores of the Pactolus, something equally remarkable was happening on the other side of the world, in China, in the valleys of the Yellow River, where civilization had been flowering independently for thousands of years. The Chinese did not learn about coins from Lydia. They invented the concept entirely on their own, which tells us something profound, that coinage is not an accident or a quirk, but a solution that human intelligence reaches when the conditions are right. When trade expands beyond a certain complexity, when communities grow beyond a certain size, when the web of obligation and exchange becomes too dense to manage informally, money appears, not because someone decided it should, but because it must. In China, the earliest forms of metal money were not round coins at all. They were tools. Specifically, they were miniaturized versions of actual agricultural and crafting tools. Tiny bronze spades and hoes, miniature bronze knives and fish hooks. These tool-shaped money objects began appearing in China around the 7th or 8th century BCE, perhaps even earlier, in the region of what is now Henan province, the heartland of the ancient Chinese state. It is a wonderful detail if you think about it. In a culture where a spade or a hoe was one of the most fundamental objects of daily life, the difference between food and famine, between survival and hunger, it made perfect sense that the tool itself would become a symbol of value. The first Chinese money said, in its very shape, "This is worth what a spade is worth. This represents labor. This represents agriculture. This represents the fundamental productive work of human civilization." These spade-shaped coins, called bu in Chinese, came in various sizes and designs. Some were quite large, close in size to actual small spades. Others were smaller, representing fractions of value. They had holes in them, the hole where a handle would fit on a real spade, and this hole would eventually transform into the distinctive square hole at the center of Chinese coins, a feature that would persist for more than 2,000 years. The knife-shaped coins, called Dao, were equally charming in their literalism. They looked exactly like small bronze knives, with a blade, a handle, and a ring at the end. In the states of Qi and Yan in northeastern China, knife money was the dominant currency for centuries. In the states to the south and west, spade money predominated, and in some regions, cowrie shells, or bronze imitations of cowrie shells, continued to circulate alongside the metal tools. Then came one of the most dramatic unifications in world history, and with it, a radical simplification of Chinese money. In 221 BCE, the king of the state of Qin, a man of extraordinary ambition and ferocious determination, known to history as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, completed his military conquest of all the rival Chinese states. After decades of brutal warfare, China was unified under a single emperor for the first time. This was the man who built the Great Wall, who created the famous terracotta army to guard his tomb, who standardized weights and measures across the vast new empire, and who standardized money. The first emperor abolished all the various regional currencies, the spade coins, the knife coins, the cowrie shells, the bronze replicas, the endless variety of the local monetary systems that had made trade between regions complicated and unreliable. In their place, he mandated a single imperial currency, a round bronze coin with a square hole in the center, the round coin with the square hole. Simple, elegant, memorable. And yet there was philosophy in this shape that the ancient Chinese took seriously. The circle represented heaven, round, perfect, infinite, without beginning or end. The square represented earth, solid, stable, bounded, reliable. A coin was thus in its very geometry a statement about the relationship between heaven and earth, between the celestial order and the earthly world of human commerce. This coin design, the round coin with the square hole, would endure in China with remarkable consistency for more than 2,000 years. Dynasties would rise and fall, emperors would succeed emperors, wars would be fought and won and lost, the borders of China would expand and contract like a breathing thing. But the basic shape of the Chinese coin remained. Round, bronze, with a square hole in the middle. You could thread a string through that square hole, and the Chinese did. Great strings of coins, called cash, carried looped over the shoulder or coiled at the waist. A string of 1,000 coins was a common unit of account. Merchants counted coins by running them through their fingers. The soft metallic clicking of bronze on bronze, a familiar sound in every market in China. The square hole served a practical purpose beyond philosophy. It allowed a square rod to be inserted through a stack of coins, holding them steady while their edges were filed smooth and uniform. This was how the imperial mint ensured consistency of size and weight across millions of coins. The hole was both symbol and technology. Now that coins existed, in Lydia, in Greece, in Persia, in India, in China, the question becomes, what happened next? What did the world actually look like in the centuries after coinage spread? How did this small invention change the texture of daily life, the rhythms of commerce, the very possibilities of human civilization? The answer is, it changed everything, slowly, not all at once, and in different ways in different places. But the direction of change was profound and ultimately irreversible. The most immediate effect was the democratization of trade. Before coins, serious long-distance trade was largely the province of temples, palaces, and very wealthy merchant families who had the resources to maintain the complex networks of credit, trust, and debt that trade required in the pre-coin era. Small farmers, craftspeople, common labourers, they might trade locally in their village or town, but participation in regional or long-distance trade was largely beyond their means. Coins changed this. A small farmer who had a surplus of wool could bring it to market, sell it for coins, and use those coins to buy anything available for sale, not just things that the buyer of his wool happened to want to trade. The chain of exchanges that had previously required careful orchestration over days or weeks could now happen in a single afternoon. Markets grew, not just village markets, but regional markets, seasonal fairs, permanent market towns. When coins exist, markets become possible in a new way, because a market is really just a place where strangers come together to exchange things, and strangers can only exchange things efficiently if they share a medium of exchange that both trust. Coins were that medium. In Greece, the explosion of coinage in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE coincided directly with an explosion of market activity that historians have traced through archaeology, literary sources and inscriptions. The agora, the open central space of a Greek city that served as marketplace, political meeting ground and social hub, became the literal and symbolic centre of Greek life. The English word agoraphobia, the fear of open spaces, derives from the agora. The word itself meant gathering place, and coins made the gathering richer, more varied, more complex. In Athens, by the 5th century BCE, you could go to the agora and find fish sellers, olive oil merchants, cheese vendors, potters, sandal makers, cloth merchants, jewellers, perfumers, barbers, prostitutes, philosophers, and politicians, all within a few hundred yards of each other, all conducting business in silver coins. The silver coins of Athens, stamped with the owl of Athena on one side and the helmeted head of the goddess herself on the other, became perhaps the most widely used currency in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Athenian owl, as it was called, was recognizable from Spain to Egypt to the shores of the Black Sea. Athenian silver came from the great mines at Laurion in southern Attica, where thousands of slaves worked in brutal conditions to extract the ore that would be refined and minted into the coins that funded the Athenian fleet, the Athenian temples, the Athenian empire. The owl was the symbol of wisdom, of Athena, of Athens, but it was also a symbol of something more prosaic and more powerful, reliable, trusted, widely accepted money. The Athenian owls were struck to a consistent standard, the Attic standard, and their purity was renowned. Merchants across the Mediterranean preferred Athenian owls to coins of uncertain quality from less established mints. The reputation of Athenian silver was itself a form of economic power. What does trade look like when it actually works? When money flows freely and trust exists, it looks like ships. It looks like grain from Egypt flowing to Athens and Athenian pottery flowing to Egypt. It looks like wine from the Aegean Islands reaching the shores of the Black Sea, and dried fish from the Crimea ending up on tables in Corinth. It looks like a merchant in Miletus planning a voyage not just to the next port but to ports 3 weeks sailing away, knowing that wherever she arrives, the coins in her chest will speak a language that will be understood. Long-distance trade had existed before coins, certainly, but coins made it dramatically easier, dramatically faster, and dramatically more available to a wider range of participants. The Bronze Age trade networks of the ancient Mediterranean, those extraordinary webs of exchange that scholars have mapped through the movement of tin, copper, and other materials, those networks were real, but they were slow, complex, and largely confined to elite exchanges between palace economies. With coins, trade became, for the first time, something approaching a true market. Prices responded to supply and demand. Competition between sellers drove prices down and quality up. The merchant who offered the best product at the best price succeeded. The one who offered inferior goods at inflated prices failed. This was the market mechanism, imperfect, chaotic, sometimes brutal, but also extraordinarily efficient at allocating resources and generating wealth. And wealth, once generated, could be accumulated, invested, and used to generate more wealth. The virtuous cycle of market economies, save, invest, grow, repeat, was now possible in a way that had never been possible before. There is a quiet, remarkable aspect to all of this that I want to linger over for a moment. Before coins, the primary path to wealth was conquest, taking by force what others had accumulated. Kings built wealth by raiding, by war, by tribute extracted from defeated peoples. The fundamental logic was zero-sum. For me to have more, someone else must have less. Coins introduced a different possibility. Trade, when it works properly, is positive sum. When I trade my surplus barley for your surplus pottery, we're both better off. You have barley you needed, I have pottery I needed. Neither of us is poorer. Both of us are richer. Richer in what we actually need, rather than in what we merely have. This is a profound philosophical shift in the logic of human society. It did not happen overnight, and it did not replace the logic of conquest. War and tribute and forced extraction remained central to ancient economies for millennia. But alongside those darker forces, coins introduced something new. The possibility that prosperity could be created rather than merely seized. The merchants who moved between cities, carrying goods from where they were abundant to where they were scarce, were not just making themselves wealthy. They were in a very real sense making the world wealthier. They were doing something genuinely productive, and coins, portable, divisible, trusted, were the technology that made their work possible. As the 5th century BCE gave way to the 4th, a young king in Macedonia was watching the power of money with clear, calculating eyes. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, understood that armies needed paying, that loyalty required wages, that an empire could not be built on conquest alone but had to be sustained by the economic machinery of commerce and coinage. When Alexander's armies swept east in 334 BCE, defeating the Persian Empire of Darius III and pushing on to India, they carried coins with them. Alexander minted coins aggressively. Great quantities of silver tetradrachms and gold staters struck at mints established across his vast new empire. These coins bore his image, or that of Heracles and Zeus, deities with whom Alexander claimed divine connection. The sheer volume of Alexander's coinage tells us something important. When he captured the Persian royal treasury at Persepolis, a treasure accumulated over centuries by the kings of Persia, he found vast quantities of gold and silver bullion, much of it sitting unused in palace storerooms. Alexander melted it and minted it. He turned static, accumulated wealth into circulating productive money. He paid his soldiers, paid his engineers, paid the craftspeople and merchants who followed his armies and built his cities. One ancient source estimates that Alexander put into circulation the equivalent of perhaps 180,000 talents of silver, a staggering sum. And this money flowed through the economies of his conquered territories like water into parched earth. Trade expanded, markets grew, the great cities of the Hellenistic world, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, Pergamon in Asia Minor, became thriving centers of commerce and culture, their economies fueled by the coins that circulated through their marketplaces. Persian money, too, was remarkable. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire that Alexander defeated, had its own sophisticated coinage. The gold daric, named after King Darius I, was one of the most beautiful and widely circulated coins of the ancient world. On one side, a running archer, the king of Persia himself shown in profile, half kneeling, bow drawn. The image was precise and powerful, and the coin was struck to an extraordinarily consistent standard. The daric was so trusted that it circulated far beyond the borders of the Persian Empire, used as a reference currency in trade from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Darius used his coins deliberately as instruments of soft power, as we might say today. By minting large quantities of high-quality gold coins, by ensuring that the daric was reliable and consistent, he was extending Persian authority into the realm of commerce in ways that armies could not reach. A Persian coin in a Greek merchant's purse was a quiet kind of Persian presence, a reminder of Persian power, Persian reliability, Persian order. Then there was Rome. Oh, Rome! Let us turn toward Rome, that enormous world-building, world-devouring civilization, and let us think about money and coins in the context of the grandest empire the Western world has ever seen. Rome's monetary history is long and complex, spanning nearly 1,000 years from the early Republic to the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE. In the early Republic, Rome used bronze by weight. Weighed bronze, called S-grave, heavy bronze, rough, irregular lumps of metal that required scales and negotiation just as the ancient Mesopotamian silver had. But as Rome expanded, as its trade networks grew, as it came into contact with the Greek world of the Mediterranean and its sophisticated coin-based economies, Rome adapted. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome was minting proper coins. The silver denarius, from the Latin denarius, meaning containing 10 because it was originally worth 10 asses, the bronze coin that was Rome's basic unit, became the backbone of the Roman economy. The denarius would be used for centuries. The word is the ancestor of the penny in English. The symbol for the old penny, D, stood for denarius. The denier in French, the dinero in Spanish, the dinar in Arabic. In the linguistic sediment of a dozen modern languages, the Roman denarius still leaves its trace. Roman coins were instruments of propaganda as much as commerce. Every emperor minted coins with his own portrait, and those coins circulated to every corner of the empire, from Britain to Mesopotamia, carrying the emperor's face into the hands of millions of people who would never see him in person. A soldier in a garrison on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, far from Rome, would handle coins bearing the emperor's likeness regularly. The small metal disc a reminder of the distant power that paid his wages and expected his loyalty. The messages on Roman coins were carefully crafted. Victories were commemorated. New titles were announced. Divine associations were claimed. When Vespasian came to power in the chaos following Nero's fall, one of his first acts was to mint new coins bearing his portrait, a calculated statement of legitimacy, of imperial authority, of here is your new ruler, circulating through every market, every army camp, every harbour in the Roman world. And the Roman army itself was perhaps the single largest engine driving monetary demand in the ancient world. Legionaries were paid in silver denarii, regular, reliable wages, a radical concept in a world where most labour was coerced or unpaid. A legionary in the 1st century CE received around 225 denarii per year, reduced by deductions for food, equipment, and burial club, but still a significant cash income. When you multiplied this across the hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Roman army, you got an enormous and constant demand for coins. The Roman mint was one of the empire's most important institutions. Now, I want to take you somewhere quieter, away from emperors and armies and the great machinery of empire. I want to take you to a night market in a Roman provincial city, Lugdunum perhaps, which is today the city of Lyon in France, or Londinium, which is London, or Carthago Nova, which is Cartagena in Spain. Choose your city. The details would not have been very different. It is evening. The summer sun has set, but the sky is still warm, a deep blue fading to purple in the west with the first stars just beginning to appear. The market is winding down, but not yet finished. There is still business to be done, still the flicker of oil lamps over wooden stalls, still the sound of voices bargaining in a mixture of Latin and whatever the local language was. A woman, let us call her Lucia, is making her way through the market with a small purse at her belt. She has had a good day. She has sold 20 measures of her family's olive oil to a tavern keeper, receiving in return a handful of silver denarii. Now she needs to spend some of that silver. She stops at a bread stall. The loaves are round and flat, slightly burnt at the bottom from the stone oven, fragrant with wheat and something herbal. The baker, a broad man with floury hands, names a price. 1 as for a small loaf, 2 asses for the large one. Lucia has denarii, not asses, but that is no problem. The baker has change. He has a worn leather pouch full of small copper coins, asses and sesterti, alongside a few denarii. He takes her denarius, counts out her change from his pouch, hands her the bread and a few small coins. Transaction complete. Clean, fast, unambiguous. She moves on. She buys dried figs, a small handful for a couple of asses. She buys a bunch of herbs, thyme, rosemary, something she cannot identify, but the herb seller assures her is excellent for headaches. She considers briefly whether to buy a small clay lamp that catches her eye at a potter's stall. The price is reasonable, but she decides to wait. She stops finally at a wine shop. Not to drink, not yet, not at this hour, not with the children waiting at home, but to buy a flask of decent wine for the evening. She and her husband will drink it with their meal, the children already asleep by then, the lamp burning low on the table. 1 cup of wine each, and maybe a conversation about the harvest, about the neighbour's new baby, about the festival next week. The wine seller pours a small sample. She tastes. She nods. They agree on a price. Coins change hands. The transaction is complete. In the span of perhaps half an hour, Lucia has conducted 4 separate commercial transactions: bread, figs, herbs, wine, with 4 different sellers, none of whom she knew personally, none of whom she needed to know personally. She did not need to barter. She did not need to negotiate the relative quality of olive oil against wine or bread against herbs. She simply exchanged coins, and coins were coins. The exchange was clean and quick and painless. This is what money does. This is the invisible infrastructure of civilized life, the social technology, ancient and taken for granted, that makes it possible for strangers to exchange goods and labour and ideas without requiring the elaborate negotiation, the personal trust, the complex web of mutual obligation that trade without money demands. Lucia walked home with her bread and her wine and her change, the small coins warm in her purse, and she did not think about coins at all. They were just coins. They were just money. She had no idea she was living inside a revolution. The bread that Lucia bought in that evening market, the round, flat, slightly burnt loaf from a Lugdunian bakery, was, in a very real sense, made possible by an entire monetary ecosystem. Let us trace that loaf back a little, gently, and see the coins moving through the web. The baker had bought his flour from a miller. The miller had bought his grain from a farmer. The farmer had hired labourers to help with the harvest, paying them daily wages. The labourers had used their wages to buy food from the market, bread, perhaps, from the very baker who had paid the miller who had paid the farmer. The money circulated. It moved. It connected people who would never meet, who had no personal relationship, who did not need to trust each other as individuals because they all trusted the coins. This is the fundamental miracle of money. It is a universal language of exchange spoken between strangers. Before money, exchange required personal relationship, personal knowledge, personal trust. With money, you could trade with someone you had never met and would never meet again, and the exchange could still be clean and fair and certain. In the ancient world, coins touched the lives of ordinary people in ways both practical and symbolic. Taxes, first and foremost. Roman tax collectors, the much despised publicani, Private contractors who had bought the right to collect taxes in a given region required payment in coin. This single fact drove monetization even into the most rural, most self-sufficient corners of the Roman world. A farmer in a remote valley who had never personally needed coins, who grew his own food, made his own tools, traded locally with neighbors, was still forced to acquire coins when tax time came. He might sell a portion of his harvest to a travelling merchant for coin, or he might earn coin by working for wages on a neighbour's estate. But somehow, some way, he had to come up with the silver. This tax-driven demand for coins was one of the most powerful forces driving the spread of market economies throughout history. Governments that demanded taxes in coin were, whether they intended to or not, forcing their populations to participate in money economies, to produce for the market, to engage in commerce. It was coercive, often brutal in its application, but it was also, paradoxically, one of the great drivers of economic development and integration. Wages were paid in coin. The Roman army, as I mentioned, paid its soldiers regularly, but so did private employers, builders, mine operators, workshop owners, ship captains. Daily wage labour, paid in small coins at the end of each day's work, was common in ancient cities. In Athens, a skilled craftsman might earn 2 or 3 drachmas a day. In Rome, a labourer might earn 1 to 2 sestertii. These were not generous wages by modern standards, but they were real wages, money that could be spent on anything available in the market, giving the wage earner a real degree of economic freedom. Savings too were kept in coins, stored in clay pots, in leather bags, in hollow beams, under floorboards, in wells. The rich deposited coins with bankers, lending them out at interest and receiving interest in return. The poor buried their savings in the ground, hoping they would still be there when they were needed. And therein lies one of the richest archives of ancient monetary life, the coin hoard. All over the ancient world, in Britain, in France, in Turkey, in Israel, in India, in North Africa, archaeologists regularly uncover ceramic pots filled with ancient coins, carefully hidden and then never retrieved. Someone hid their savings, and something happened. War, death, flight, disaster, that prevented them from coming back for them. Their terrible misfortune has become our extraordinary window into the monetary life of the ancient world. These hoards tell us which coins circulated where and when, and in what quantities. They tell us about trade routes and political borders and economic crises. A hoard of Roman coins found in India tells us that Roman merchants were trading there, that Roman silver was flowing east along the spice routes. A hoard of Greek coins found in Afghanistan tells us something similar about the reach of Hellenistic commerce. Every hoard is a frozen moment, a small tragedy of personal loss that has become a treasure of historical knowledge. There's another aspect of daily life with coins that I want to mention softly, because it tells us something important about the humanity of our ancestors. The coins they kept not for practical use, but for meaning. People in the ancient world did not only use coins to buy things, they used them as amulets, they used them as offerings to the gods, they wore them as jewellery, they put them in the mouths of their dead to pay the ferrymen who carried souls across the river of the underworld, a practice called the obol of Charon, after the Greek coin placed in or near the bodies of the deceased. In ancient Greece, the obol, a small silver coin, 1/6 of a drachma, worth perhaps the price of a simple meal, was placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the dead. The mythology said that Charon, the grim ferryman of the underworld, demanded payment to carry a soul across the Styx. A soul without a coin to pay him was doomed to wander the near bank of the river for 100 years before being allowed to cross. Think about what this tells us. Coins had so thoroughly permeated the Greek understanding of reality that they imagined the afterlife to be governed by the same economic logic as the living world. Even death required payment. Even the gods operated within a monetary framework. Coins were not just practical tools, they were part of the fundamental structure of how people understood the universe. Coins were also offered in temples, thrown into sacred springs and wells as prayers made physical, as bargains struck with divine powers. The practice continues today. We throw coins into fountains and make wishes, a 21st century echo of an ancient transaction with the sacred. The wishing well is a coin-offering ritual thousands of years old. I would not be giving you the full story, gentle listener, if I spoke only of the light that coins brought to the world. Like all powerful human inventions, money carried within it the seeds of its own dark possibilities, and those seeds flowered in every ancient civilization that adopted coinage. Let us speak softly and without judgment of the darker aspects of this story. Counterfeiting was as old as coins themselves. Within decades, perhaps even years, of the first coins being struck in Lydia, someone was trying to fake them. The basic temptation was irresistible. If a piece of metal can pass as a silver coin worth a day's wages, but can be made with much less silver, or no silver at all, the profit to be made from deception is enormous. Ancient counterfeiters were creative and persistent. One of the most common techniques was plating, taking a coin-sized disc of copper or lead and coating it with a thin layer of genuine silver or gold. From the outside, it looked perfect. Only testing, biting the coin, which could dent soft silver but not hard copper, or scratching it against a touchstone, might reveal the fraud. Archaeological sites have yielded large numbers of ancient plated coins, the silver or gold coating long since worn or flaked away to reveal the base metal beneath. Another technique was shaving or clipping, carefully trimming the edges of genuine coins to remove small amounts of precious metal, then spending the coin as if it were full weight. Over time, enough shavings could be collected and melted down to produce new fraudulent coins. Ancient law was harsh on this practice. In Rome, clipping or counterfeiting coins was a capital offence. But the practice never stopped. Even governments counterfeited their own coins, though they called it by a more dignified name, debasement. Debasement. Quietly reducing the amount of precious metal in government-issued coins while maintaining their nominal face value was one of the most tempting and ultimately destructive fiscal tools available to ancient rulers. The Roman Empire provides the most dramatic and best documented example of ancient monetary debasement, and following it through the centuries is like watching a slow-motion economic disaster. In the 1st century CE, the silver denarius was approximately 90 to 95% pure silver. By the reign of Septimius Severus at the end of the 2nd century, it had fallen to around 50%. By the mid-3rd century, during the chaotic period of military anarchy, when emperors rose and fell with terrifying rapidity, the denarius had collapsed to perhaps 2 to 5% silver, a bronze coin with the thinnest possible silver wash. To get more money, successive emperors had minted more coins, putting less silver in each one. But the people who received those coins were not fooled. They knew what was happening. They demanded more coins for the same goods, driving up prices. This is inflation. The ancient world had it just as painfully as the modern world does, and it was driven by exactly the same basic cause. Too much money chasing too few goods. When the government pumped out enormous quantities of debased coins, it was effectively increasing the money supply without any corresponding increase in actual goods and services. The result was rising prices, economic uncertainty, hoarding of older, more valuable coins, and general social distress. The 3rd century CE saw some of the worst inflation in Roman history. Soldiers demanded wage increases to keep up with rising prices. The government minted more coins to pay the soldiers. The more coins it minted, the faster prices rose. The state was trapped in a spiral that would take generations, and eventually the radical monetary reform of Emperor Diocletian at the end of the century to even partially address. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 CE, is one of the most extraordinary economic documents of the ancient world. Facing ruinous inflation, Diocletian issued a comprehensive price control, setting maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services, from wheat and olive oil to haircuts and chariot repairs, from the finest purple silk to the humblest clay pot. Violating the price controls was punishable by death. It did not work. Price controls rarely do when the underlying monetary problem is not solved. Merchants simply refused to sell at the mandated prices, preferring to hide their goods or smuggle them to neighbouring regions. Shortages resulted. The edict was eventually abandoned, but it survives in inscriptions on stone from dozens of locations across the former empire, a ghost of imperial authority over the most fundamental forces of economic life. Greed, of course, was the engine that drove counterfeiting and debasement alike. And greed, the love of money for its own sake, the endless desire for more, was something that ancient moralists and philosophers talked about constantly, with a mixture of fascination and horror. The ancient Greeks had a word for excessive love of money, philaguria, literally love of silver. It was considered a vice, a corruption of the soul, a distortion of values. Plato wrote extensively about the dangers of money love to the just soul and the just city. Aristotle distinguished between economics, the proper management of a household or community, focused on genuine needs, and crematistics, the pursuit of wealth as an end in itself, which he regarded as a perversion of the natural order. The Stoics were particularly fierce on this point. The philosopher Epictetus, himself a former slave who'd known genuine poverty and genuine freedom, wrote with contempt about men who spent their lives accumulating coins, only to leave them behind at death. Seneca, the immensely wealthy Stoic philosopher who served as advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote brilliantly, if somewhat hypocritically given his enormous personal fortune, about the vanity of riches and the corruption that money love brought to the soul. But none of this prevented people from pursuing money with tremendous energy. Philosophy rarely defeats appetite, and the appetite for money, once awakened by the existence of coins, by the existence of a portable, storable, universally accepted store of value, proved to be one of the most powerful forces in human history. We have lingered gently and lovingly in the ancient world, but money does not stop with coins. The story continues across centuries and millennia, and I want to take you further east, further forward in time, to the moment when another extraordinary innovation changed the game once again. We go to China, to the Tang dynasty, roughly the 7th century CE, and then to the Song dynasty, from the 10th to the 13th centuries, one of the most economically sophisticated civilizations in the pre-modern world. The Song dynasty of China is one of the great economic miracles of world history, and it is not nearly as well known in the West as it deserves to be. During the Song period, China had the largest and most sophisticated economy in the world. Its population was enormous, perhaps 100 million people or more. Its cities were vast and cosmopolitan. Its technology was centuries ahead of Europe in many areas, printing, gunpowder, the compass, advanced metallurgy, and, crucially for our story, paper money. The problem that led to paper money in China was, once again, the problem of weight. Bronze coins were fine for everyday transactions, but when merchants needed to move large quantities of wealth across long distances, carrying chests of heavy coins was impractical and dangerous. Bandits, floods, overloaded pack animals, a merchant transporting a year's worth of profits from one city to another faced enormous logistical challenges. The solution emerged organically, as so many great innovations do from the practices of merchants themselves. Merchants began depositing their coins with trusted deposit houses in one city and receiving in return a paper certificate, a jiaozi, or flying money, that could be exchanged for coins at an associated office in another city. The paper certificate flew through the air, light as a bird, while the heavy coins stayed safely in the vault. The government, recognizing both the convenience and the revenue potential, eventually took over the issuance of these certificates and made them official paper currency. By the 11th century, the Song government was issuing paper money in large quantities, printed on special paper with complex designs to prevent counterfeiting, bearing official seals, promising the holder a specific quantity of coins on demand. The Venetian traveller Marco Polo, who visited China in the late 13th century during the Mongol Yuan dynasty that succeeded the Song, was astonished by the paper money system he found there. He wrote about it with something between admiration and bewilderment, describing how the Great Khan's paper money was accepted everywhere in his empire on pain of death for refusal, and how the Khan could create money literally from paper and ink. For a European, this was incomprehensible. In medieval Europe, the idea that a piece of paper could be money was barely thinkable. Money was metal, gold and silver. The tangibility was the point. Paper was just paper. But paper money represented the logical endpoint of the idea that had been developing since those first Lydian coins. The leap from weighed silver to stamped coins was the leap from commodity value to symbolic value. The understanding that money's value comes not from the material itself, but from the guarantee behind it. Paper money simply completed that journey. The paper itself had no commodity value at all. Its value was entirely symbolic, entirely dependent on the authority and trustworthiness of the institution that issued it. This is what is meant by fiat money, from the Latin fiat meaning let it be. Money that is money because the issuing authority says it is money, and because people believe that guarantee. All modern money, every dollar bill, every euro, every digital balance in a bank account, is fiat money. Its value is not inherent in the paper or the metal or the digital record. Its value is in the collective agreement, the shared social trust that it is valuable. That idea that was half-born in Lydia when the first king stamped his seal into electrum, was completed in Song dynasty China 5,500 miles away and 1,500 years later, when a government first issued paper certificates and declared them to be money. Banking, the idea of taking deposits, making loans and charging interest, had also existed in various forms since ancient times. The temples of Babylon, as I mentioned, functioned as early banks. Greek trapezitai, literally table setters, so called because they conducted business at small tables in the agora, changed foreign currencies, took deposits, and made loans. Roman argentari performed similar functions, but banking as a sophisticated, interconnected system that could extend credit across long distances and facilitate complex commercial transactions that developed in medieval Italy in the cities of Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Siena during the 11th through 14th centuries. The word bank comes from the Italian banco, meaning bench or table, the same physical description that gave us the Greek trapeza. Medieval Italian bankers sat at benches in marketplaces, offering money-changing services, taking deposits, issuing letters of credit, and making loans. If a banker failed, if he could not meet his obligations to depositors, tradition held that his bench would be broken. A broken bench. Bancarotta. Bankruptcy. The great Italian banking families, the Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Strozzi, became enormously powerful through their banking operations. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1397, operated branches across Europe and the Middle East, extending credit to kings and popes, financing crusades and trade expeditions, accumulating a fortune that funded the Italian Renaissance. Michelangelo, Leonardo, Botticelli, all of them worked, directly or indirectly, thanks in part to the Medici fortune, and the Medici fortune was built on banking, and banking was built on the management of money. One of the most important innovations of medieval banking was the letter of credit, a document promising payment to the bearer in a distant city. A Florentine merchant who needed to travel to London to buy wool did not need to carry a chest of gold coins across the Alps, through bandit-infested mountain passes, across treacherous seas. He could deposit his gold with a Florentine banker, receive a letter of credit, travel safely to London, and present that letter at the London branch of the same banking network. The London bankers would verify the letter and pay him in local currency. The gold never moved. The transaction happened through paper, through trust, through the network of relationships between banking houses that spanned the continent. This system, the bill of exchange, the letter of credit, the transfer of value across distance without physical movement of metal, was the ancestor of the modern international banking system. The principles have not changed. Only the technology has. The gold standard, which dominated global monetary policy from the late 19th century until the 20th, was in some ways a return to the ancient idea of commodity-backed money, the idea that money should represent and be redeemable in a fixed quantity of precious metal. Under the gold standard, every major currency was pegged to a specific quantity of gold. A British pound was worth a specific number of grains of gold. An American dollar was worth a specific number of grains of gold. The exchange rate between them was therefore fixed and certain. The advantages were real: stable exchange rates, limits on government money printing, international monetary discipline. The disadvantages were also real: rigidity in the face of economic shocks, deflationary pressures, inability to expand money supply in response to growth or crisis. The gold standard was finally definitively abandoned when the United States under President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility into gold in 1971. Since then, all the world's major currencies have been pure fiat money, floating, unbacked by any commodity, valuable only because governments declare them valuable, and populations accept that declaration. And yet the system works, mostly, imperfectly, with crises and corrections and occasional spectacular failures. But it works, because the fundamental insight of the ancient coin makers of Lydia has proven correct. Value is, at bottom, a social agreement. Money works because we all agree it works. The king's stamp, the banker's letter, the government's promise, the central bank's guarantee, all of these are different expressions of the same ancient truth. And now we have travelled a long way together, from the village of Enlil and his barley, through the markets of Lydia and Athens and Rome, through the paper money of Song dynasty China, through the banking halls of Renaissance Florence, to the gold standard and its eventual dissolution, to the floating fiat currencies of the modern world. Let us rest here for a moment. Breathe. Let the weight of all those centuries settle gently around you, and then, if you are willing, let us wander a little further, not in a straight line now, but meander, as rivers meander, following whatever catches our quiet attention. There are so many more stories left to tell. Small stories, specific stories, the stories that live in the details and the corners. Let us find them. There is a coin I want to tell you about. It is one of the most famous coins in the history of the ancient world, and it is small enough to hold between 2 fingers, a thin disk of silver, no larger than a modern quarter. On one side there is an owl. It stands facing you, plump and dignified, with enormous circular eyes that seem to stare straight through you, and behind it an olive branch and a small crescent moon. On the other side there is a face in profile, a woman with a crested helmet, strong features, a calm, serene expression that seems to see further than ordinary eyes. Around her, in simple Greek letters, a THE, Athens. This is the Athenian tetradrachm, the 4-drachma coin that was the workhorse of ancient Mediterranean trade for over 300 years. The owl and the goddess Athena, her patron deity. These coins were minted in enormous quantities at Athens' city mint, called the Argyrokopaion, the silver working place. The silver came from the mines at Laurion in Attica, worked by thousands of enslaved people in conditions of brutal hardship, deep underground in tunnels barely wide enough for a human body, breathing air thick with dust and lamp smoke. The contrast is important to hold in mind. The beautiful coin, the symbol of Athenian civilization and democratic achievement, was built on the labour of enslaved human beings working in hellish conditions. This is not a footnote to the history of Athenian money. It is central to it. The Laurion mines are estimated to have produced somewhere between 3.5 and 11 million tetradrachms worth of silver over the life of their operation. That silver funded the Athenian fleet that defeated Persia at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE. It funded the construction of the Parthenon. It paid the wages of the Athenian army. It made possible the extraordinary cultural flowering of 5th century Athens, the age of Pericles, of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, of Socrates and Plato, of Phidias and the great sculptors. All of it resting on silver, all of the silver resting on enslaved labour. The coin in your hand, beautiful and serene, with its owl and its goddess, carries within it the full complexity of ancient civilization. The Athenian owl was so trusted, so widely recognized, so reliably consistent in weight and purity, that it circulated far beyond the borders of Attica. Owls have been found in coin hoards as far away as Afghanistan, India, and Egypt. The owl was, in a very real sense, the dollar of the ancient Mediterranean, the reserve currency, the universal standard, the coin that everyone accepted because everyone knew what it was. The Indian subcontinent had its own independent tradition of coinage, which developed around the 6th century BCE, roughly contemporary with Lydia and China, another remarkable case of parallel invention, driven by similar economic needs. The earliest Indian coins, called punch-marked coins or karshapana, were unlike any coins we've discussed so far. They were not struck with a die. They were not cast in a mould. They were flat pieces of silver, cut or punched into roughly rectangular or irregular shapes, and then stamped with a series of punch marks, symbols representing various objects, animals, geometric designs, and what appear to be emblems of particular ruling houses or merchant guilds. These punch-marked coins are endlessly fascinating to numismatists, coin historians, because of their complexity. A single coin might have 5, 6, or 7 different punch marks applied at different times, perhaps by different issuing authorities, each mark certifying some aspect of the coin's weight, purity, or provenance. They are like a conversation in metal, a layered record of the coin's journey through multiple hands and multiple certifications. By the time of the Great Maurya Empire in the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, the empire of Chandragupta Maurya and his famous grandson Ashoka, Indian coinage had become more sophisticated and standardized, though the punch-mark tradition continued alongside newer minting techniques. Ashoka, who ruled from approximately 268 to 232 BCE, is one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history. An emperor who converted to Buddhism after the horrific violence of his military conquest of the state of Kalinga, and who subsequently dedicated his reign to the principles of non-violence, tolerance, and what he called dharma, righteous living. His edicts, carved on pillars and rocks across the subcontinent, are among the earliest surviving examples of extended royal inscription in South Asia. Ashoka's coins are humble by the standards of Alexander or the Ptolemies, simple punch-mark silver pieces without the elaborate portraiture of Hellenistic coinage. But they circulated across an enormous empire, from what is now Afghanistan to the tip of the Indian peninsula, and they represent one of the great unifying forces in the history of South Asian civilization. Later, after the collapse of the Maurya Empire, the Indian subcontinent saw an extraordinary flowering of coinage under a succession of rulers, the Greco-Bactrian kings, whose coins combined Greek artistic styles with South Asian elements, the Kushana emperors, whose multilingual coins reflected their position astride the great Silk Road trade routes, the Gupta dynasty, whose gold coins are considered some of the most artistically beautiful in the ancient world. Gupta gold coins, issued by emperors like Chandragupta I and Samudragupta in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, show the ruler in various heroic poses, playing the veena, a stringed instrument, shooting a tiger with a bow, performing a horse sacrifice. The artistic quality is extraordinary, fluid, confident, full of life and detail. These coins were not just currency, they were proclamations of royal culture, miniature portraits of the ideals of Gupta civilization. The Silk Road. Even the name is a kind of poetry, isn't it? A road made of silk, a path of luxury and desire running thousands of miles across the roof of the world. The Silk Road, or rather, the network of land and sea routes that connected China to Rome, Central Asia to the Mediterranean, India to the Persian Gulf, was the greatest long-distance trading network in the pre-modern world. Along its dusty paths and ocean lanes moved silk and spices, porcelain and glass, gold and horses, ideas and religions and languages, and coins. Oh, the coins that moved along the Silk Road. Roman gold ore found in Chinese burial sites, Chinese bronze coins found in Roman-era sites in East Africa, Indian punch-marked coins turning up in Central Asian hoards alongside Greek tetradrachms and Persian darics. The Silk Road was also a road of coins, each different, each carrying the imprint of its issuing civilization, each a small ambassador of a distant world. The merchants who travelled the Silk Road, the Sogdians, who were perhaps the greatest long-distance traders of the ancient and medieval world. The Arabs who dominated the maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, the Chinese merchants who ventured west to the oases of Central Asia, all of them dealt in multiple currencies, became fluent in the monetary languages of a dozen civilizations, and developed sophisticated techniques for valuing and exchanging coins from different traditions. The money changers of the Silk Road cities, Samarkand, Dunhuang, Merv, Palmyra, were the forex traders of the ancient world. Sitting behind their tables piled with coins from Persia and China and Rome and India, weighing and testing and calculating, they mediated the monetary conversation between civilizations. Every transaction was a small act of cultural translation, a meeting of distant worlds in the small space between two hands. Let us talk about pirates and treasure. Because what is the history of money without a few stories of treasure lost and found? The Spanish pieces of 8, the peso de ocho, the 8-real coin of the Spanish colonial empire, were for a century and a half the closest thing the world had to a global reserve currency. Minted from the silver that flowed in enormous quantities from the mines of Potosi in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, pieces of 8 circulated from the Caribbean to China, from Europe to the Pacific Islands. Potosi was one of the most remarkable places on earth in the 16th and 17th centuries, a silver city perched high in the Andes at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters, where the Cerro Rico, the rich hill, yielded silver ore in quantities that seemed almost magical and were certainly catastrophic. The silver was extracted by forced indigenous labor, the mita system that the Spanish adapted from Inca precedent, in conditions that killed workers by the hundreds of thousands. An estimated 8 million indigenous people and enslaved Africans died in the mines of Potosi over the colonial period. The silver from those mountains flowed in a great river to the ports of the Caribbean and Atlantic, where it was loaded onto the great galleons, the famous Spanish treasure fleets, and transported across the ocean to Seville. From there it flowed through the Spanish economy and then outward into all of Europe and ultimately to Asia, where European merchants exchanged Spanish silver for Chinese silk and porcelain and Indian spices. The pieces of 8 were big, heavy coins, each one weighing about 27 grams of high-quality silver. They were not beautifully made, at least not in the early colonial period. The earliest ones were called cobs or macuquinas, irregularly shaped lumps of silver stamped with the Spanish royal arms, functional rather than artistic. Later they became more refined. The milled coins with their detailed portraits and Latin inscriptions that are so familiar from museum collections. These coins were used in colonial America right up to and beyond the American Revolution. The US dollar, when it was established in 1792, was explicitly defined in relation to the Spanish piece of 8. The dollar sign itself, $, may derive from the symbol for the pillar dollar, a piece of 8 design featuring the 2 pillars of Hercules wrapped with a scroll. The US did not stop accepting pieces of 8 as legal tender until 1857, and then there were the pirates. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730, was at its core a story about money. The pirates of the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic were not romantic adventurers, or not only that. They were, in economic terms, a violent response to the enormous wealth that was flowing through the sea lanes, wealth largely in the form of coins, pieces of 8, gold doubloons, silver ingots, the treasures of the Spanish Main, pirates like Blackbeard, Edward Teach, who terrorized Atlantic shipping from 1716 to 1718, and Bartholomew Roberts, who captured over 400 ships and amassed extraordinary wealth, were motivated primarily by the desire for money. Their targets were money or goods that could be converted to money. Their demands from captive ships were for money. Their spending in the pirate havens of Nassau and Tortuga was of money. The pirate utopias of the early 18th century, the settlements in Madagascar, in the Bahamas, in the remote coves of the Caribbean were sustained by the money that piracy generated. And that money was largely coins, Spanish pieces of 8, English gold guineas, French livres, Dutch ducats, any hard currency that could be seized, spent, or saved. When pirates' ships were sunk in battle or storm, those coins went to the bottom with them. When pirates buried their treasure, something they apparently did rarely despite the romantic image, since dead men can collect no interest, those coins went underground. And every so often, one of those sunken ships or buried caches is found again, centuries later, and the coins come back into the light, corroded and encrusted but still recognizable, still carrying the impressions of long-dead rulers and long-vanished empires. Medieval Europe had a complicated relationship with money and coins. On the one hand, the Church, which dominated medieval intellectual and moral life, was deeply suspicious of money-based commerce. Usury, the charging of interest on loans, was condemned by church teaching as a sin, a violation of natural law, an exploitation of the needy by the greedy. The reasoning was partly theological and partly philosophical. Money was sterile, Aristotle had said. It could not reproduce itself the way animals or crops could. To charge interest was to make money produce money, which was unnatural, and charging interest on loans to the poor was exploitative and uncharitable in ways that any Christian should recognize. In practice, of course, people charged interest. They always had. The Babylonians charged interest. The Greeks charged interest. The Romans had elaborate laws governing interest rates. Medieval Europe charged interest, but often disguised it. Interest might be described as a gift, or a penalty for late payment, or incorporated into the exchange rate of currency transactions. The great banking families of Florence and Venice and Genoa found creative ways to profit from lending while technically observing the prohibition on usury. Jews in medieval Europe were permitted to charge interest to Christians, since they were not bound by church law, a fact that both drove Jews into money-lending professions, since other professions were often legally closed to them, and simultaneously fed anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish money grubbing. The position was a trap. Excluded from most economic activity except money lending, Jews were then despised for being moneylenders. The history of medieval money is inseparable from the history of medieval anti-Semitism. Medieval coins were minted across an extraordinary patchwork of political entities: kingdoms, duchies, city-states, episcopal sees, trading companies, each with its own coinage. The result was monetary chaos that would be familiar to anyone who has tried to exchange currency while travelling in a country where the rate changes every block. A merchant travelling across medieval Europe might need to exchange money multiple times, each time losing a fraction to the money changer, each time negotiating which foreign coins were acceptable and at what rate. This chaos was gradually resolved by the emergence of dominant currencies: the Florentine florin, first minted in 1252, and the Venetian ducat, first minted in 1284, both of high-quality gold, both trusted throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. These coins served as medieval reserve currencies, the standard against which other currencies were measured, the safe harbour in a turbulent monetary sea. The florin deserves a moment of special attention. It was a beautiful coin, a thin gold disc about 20 millimeters in diameter, bearing on one side a stylized lily, the heraldic symbol of Florence, and on the other the figure of John the Baptist, patron saint of the city. It weighed 3.54 grams of almost pure gold, a standard maintained with extraordinary precision and consistency over nearly 3 centuries of minting. The florin's reliability was its superpower. In a world of clipped, debased and counterfeit coins, a florin was a florin was a florin. Merchants across Europe trusted it absolutely. By the 14th century, it was being used as a unit of account, a standard of value, even in places where actual florins were rarely seen. Contracts were written specifying payment in florins. Interest rates were calculated in florins. The florin had become an idea, a standard, as much as a physical object. The Medici Bank, which I mentioned earlier, was built in large part on the trade in florins, accepting them on deposit, lending them out at interest, disguised as currency exchange profits, and managing their flow across the European economy. The Medici's success was inseparable from the florin's success. The coin and the bank were a perfect partnership. The word mint in English comes from the Latin moneta, a title of the goddess Juno, in whose temple on the Capitoline Hill in Rome the Roman mint was located. Juno Moneta, Juno the Advisor, or Juno the Warner, gave her name to the place of coinage, and that name eventually became the word for money itself. The English money, the French money, the Italian moneta, all descended from the goddess who warned and advised. Ancient and medieval mints were fascinating workshops, combining aspects of a government office, a precious metal refinery, and an artisan studio. The work was skilled, painstaking, and physically demanding. The basic process of striking coins by hand, the process that produced virtually all coins from antiquity through the early modern period, went something like this. A smith would prepare the blank, or flan, a small piece of metal, gold, silver, copper, or bronze, of the correct weight, cast or cut to a rough disc shape. The blank was heated until soft. Then it was placed between two dies, hardened iron tools engraved with the design of the coin, and struck hard with a hammer. The hammer blow transferred the design from the dies to the softened metal, creating the coin. The lower die, called the anvil die, was fixed into a wooden block or metal post. The upper die, called the hammer die, was held against the blank and struck. This is why the reverse of many ancient coins is slightly more indistinct than the obverse. The reverse design was on the hammer die, which received the direct force of the blow and wore out faster. Skilled die cutters, engravers who carved the designs into the iron dies, were among the most valued artisans in any ancient or medieval economy. The finest of them achieved extraordinary levels of detail and beauty in their tiny designs, working with steel gravers on hard iron to create faces and figures and lettering of remarkable delicacy. Their names are almost all lost to history, but their work has survived. In the museums of the world, in the hands of collectors, in the published catalogues of numismatists, who have devoted their lives to the study of these tiny masterpieces. The Roman imperial mint, the moneta, later expanded to multiple satellite mints across the empire, produced coins in enormous quantities. At the height of the empire, billions of coins circulated across the Roman world. Billions, a number that staggers the imagination when you think of each one being individually struck by hand, by workers standing at their benches, hammer rising and falling, coin after coin emerging from between the dies. Let us think about the sound of money, because money has a sound, doesn't it? And in the ancient and medieval world that sound was constant and everywhere. The clink of coins in a leather purse, the soft rattle of bronze asses in a merchant's hand as he counted them, the sharp, clear ring of silver on silver when tested against a hard surface. A good coin rang true, a debased or plated coin gave a dull thud. The heavy silence of a gold coin placed carefully on a table. Money had a sound language that everyone understood. In the markets of ancient Athens, the agora was a constant symphony of economic life. The sound of potters' wheels and hammers, the calls of fishmongers and bread sellers, the murmur of philosophical debate, since the agora was also where Socrates walked and talked, and underneath it all, the constant quiet music of coins changing hands. Clink, rattle, ring, the music of commerce, the sound of civilization working. In the night markets of the Roman Empire, those evening markets that Lucia visited buying bread and wine under flickering lamps, the sound of coins was a kind of comfort, a reassurance that life was proceeding normally, that trade was happening, that the empire was functioning. When that sound disappeared, when markets fell silent, when coins vanished from circulation because people hoarded them in times of crisis, it was a signal that something was deeply wrong. Historians have sometimes used coin finds as a proxy for economic vitality. A region that yields many coin finds from a given period was probably prospering during that time. A region where coins disappear from the archaeological record was probably experiencing disruption, war, plague, economic collapse, political chaos. The coins, or their absence, tell the story. Let me tell you about the stock market, because the story of money does not end with coins, or even with paper money. It extends into the fascinating and somewhat vertiginous world of financial instruments, the elaborate abstractions of value that build on each other like layers of a remarkably complex cake. The first stock market in the world, the first formal institution where shares in commercial ventures could be bought and sold openly by the public, was established in Amsterdam in 1602. The occasion was the founding of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in world history. The VOC was established to conduct trade between the Netherlands and the East Indies, what is now Indonesia. The spice trade was the prize. Nutmeg and cloves and pepper and cinnamon, luxury goods worth fortunes in European markets that could be obtained cheaply in the Moluccas and sold at enormous profit. But individual merchants could not afford the enormous cost of outfitting ships for such long and dangerous voyages. The solution was to pool resources, to sell shares in the company to multiple investors, each of whom would receive a proportional share of the profits if the venture succeeded. This was not entirely new. Italian merchant partnerships had done something similar centuries earlier, but the VOC made it fully public, fully transferable, and institutionally organized. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Beurs, was established to trade these shares. Investors could buy and sell VOC shares freely, based on their assessment of the company's prospects. The price fluctuated with news from the East. A successful voyage drove prices up. A ship lost at sea drove them down. This was a market not in goods but in claims on future profits, the abstraction of value taken yet another step further from the physical world of salt and cattle and electrum. The first speculative bubble in financial history, the famous Dutch tulip mania of 1636 and 1637, occurred in this same Amsterdam environment, against this backdrop of financial innovation and expanding market activity. Tulip bulbs, exotic and fashionable, became objects of speculation. Their prices rose to extraordinary heights. A single rare bulb could command the price of a fine house, and then collapsed with terrifying suddenness, wiping out fortunes overnight. Tulip mania has become the archetypal story of speculative bubbles, invoked whenever financial markets seem to lose touch with underlying reality. But it also illustrates something important, that the same human psychology that makes markets work, the desire for profit, the willingness to take risk, the search for value, can, when unmoored from reality, creates spectacular and catastrophic delusions. The history of financial markets since 1602 is, in one sense, a series of variations on this theme. The power of money to organize human activity and create wealth, combined with the persistent human tendency to let greed and wishful thinking overwhelm careful judgment. And what of the future of money? Where does this story lead? We are living right now through another great transformation in the history of money, one as significant perhaps as the invention of coins in Lydia, or paper money in China, or the stock market in Amsterdam. Digital money, money that exists not as metal or paper but as electronic records in computer systems, is already the dominant form of money in most developed economies. Most transactions happen not in coins and bills, but in transfers between bank accounts, in credit card swipes, in phone taps at payment terminals. The physical coin, the direct descendant of those first Lydian electrum pieces with their lion heads, is now a relatively minor part of the monetary ecosystem. Cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and its many descendants, have introduced yet another layer of abstraction and another set of questions about what money is and what it needs to be. A cryptocurrency is money that exists only as a distributed digital record, maintained by a network of computers rather than by any central authority. No king stamps it. No central bank guarantees it. Its value rests entirely on the collective agreement of its users, carried to its logical extreme, the insight that was present in the very first coins. Money is a social agreement, a collective fiction that we choose to believe in because believing in it makes our lives better. The debates around cryptocurrency, about its energy consumption, its volatility, its use in illegal transactions, its potential to disrupt or democratize finance, are complex and ongoing, and I am not going to resolve them here, in the quiet dark of this night. But they are at their core very old debates dressed in new technology, debates about trust and authority, about who gets to create money and on what terms, about the relationship between money and power. These debates are as old as the first Lydian coins. Breathe now. We have come a long way. From barley to electrum to silver denarii to paper certificates to digital pixels. Always the same underlying question. Always the same challenge. How do we create and maintain trust? How do we build a system of exchange that strangers can use, that reaches across distance and time, that makes it possible for human beings to specialize and cooperate and create wealth together? Money is the answer that every civilization has been reaching for in its own way, with its own materials and its own institutions. And the fact that so many civilizations arrived at similar solutions, stamped metal, guaranteed value, trusted authority, tells us something profound about the universality of human needs and the universality of human intelligence. I want to tell you about a few more specific coins, famous coins, storied coins, coins that have become almost mythological. The Daric of Darius. We spoke of it earlier, the gold coin of the Persian Empire showing the king as a running archer. But the Daric was not just a coin, it was a diplomatic tool. Persian kings paid mercenaries in Darics, Greek mercenaries, Lydian mercenaries, Egyptian mercenaries, and those mercenaries took the gold back to their home cities and spent it there, spreading Persian gold through the Mediterranean world. A Greek soldier in Syracuse might die with a Daric in his hand, gold struck with the image of a Persian king he had never seen from a world he barely knew, the Macedonian tetradrachm of Alexander. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, His generals carved up his empire and minted coins bearing his image, honouring him, claiming his legacy, making clear their connection to the man who had conquered the world. Coins bearing Alexander's face were struck for decades, even centuries after his death. His portrait circulated across an empire that had fragmented, a ghostly presence in metal, the memory of conquest made portable. The denarius of Julius Caesar. In 44 BCE, just weeks or days before his assassination on the Ides of March, Julius Caesar did something that no living Roman had done before. He had his own portrait struck on Roman coins. Roman coins had always featured gods, personifications, or deified ancestors, never a living person. By placing his own face on the coinage, Caesar was making a statement about his status that was not lost on the senators who killed him. His portrait coins are extraordinarily rare. Few survived the immediate political chaos of his assassination, as his enemies sought to erase his memory. But some survive, small silver discs bearing the long, distinctive face of history's most famous Roman, minted in the last weeks of his life, the solidus of Constantine. When the Emperor Constantine I stabilized the Roman monetary system in the early 4th century CE, he introduced a new gold coin, the solidus, that will become one of the most stable and long-lasting currencies in history. The word soldier derives from solidus. Soldiers were paid in solid gold coins. The Byzantine Empire, heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, continued to strike solidity for 1,000 years after Constantine, maintaining their gold content and their reputation for trustworthiness across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Now I want to take you to a specific scene, a reconstructed scene, imagined but grounded in historical evidence, because sometimes history becomes most real when we inhabit it. It is the year 1348, the city of Florence, Italy. Night, a warm summer night, but the air is uneasy, thick with something beyond heat. The plague has arrived, the Black Death, the great pandemic of bubonic plague that would eventually kill 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, is moving through the city like a tide. In the Street of the Money Changers, a real district of medieval Florence, where bankers and money changers conducted business from their benches and offices, a man is sitting late by the light of a single candle. He is a money changer named Agnolo. He is middle-aged, with careful eyes and ink-stained fingers, and he is trying to balance his accounts. On the table before him, piles of coins, florins of gold, catching the candle's light and glowing like small suns. Venetian ducats, similar in size and weight to the florin, the rival city's answer to Florentine gold. Silver groats from various mints, copper piccoli, tiny coins of almost no individual value, used for the smallest transactions. Foreign coins of uncertain provenance that he has received as payment and will need to exchange. In his ledger, he's recording the day's transactions. A merchant from Siena exchanged ducats for florins. A routine transaction, except that the rate had changed since last week, because the plague had disrupted the courier networks between the cities, and no one was quite sure of the current exchange rate in Siena. Agnolo had to guess, to estimate, to make a judgment call, knowing that he might be wrong, knowing that in this moment of catastrophe, normal economic life was becoming impossible to maintain. Outside, he can hear the carts, the death carts that collect the bodies of plague victims and carry them to mass graves outside the city walls. The sound is not dramatic, it is quiet, a slow creaking of wooden wheels on stone streets, a muffled ringing of a handbell. But it is constant, and it speaks of the world that Agnolo lives in, a world being unmade, a world in which all the careful economic arrangements of daily life are collapsing under the pressure of biological catastrophe. And yet Agnolo sits at his table. He balances his accounts, he records his transactions, he continues the work of money, because money, the elaborate social technology of exchange and trust, is one of the things that holds civilization together, even when everything else seems to be falling apart. Even in the midst of the Black Death, people bought bread. Even in the midst of the plague, merchants sold wool. Even when a third of the city was dying, the coins still changed hands, because the alternative, barter, chaos, the breakdown of all commercial trust, was something that no one could afford, even in a city of the dying. Money, it turns out, is not just a convenience. It is a form of civilization itself. It is the infrastructure of human cooperation, the foundation on which everything else is built. When it fails, when hyperinflation destroys its value, when banks collapse and credit freezes, when people lose faith in the currency, the effects ripple through every aspect of society. Food becomes scarce because farmers won't sell for worthless money. Governments collapse because they cannot pay their employees. Social order frays because the basic transactions of daily life become impossible. This is what the ancient Lydians gave us. Not just a useful tool, an infrastructure, a foundation, a way of being together in the world that makes everything else possible. Let us talk about treasure hoards one more time because they deserve more than a passing mention. The Hoxton hoard, discovered in 1992 in the English county of Suffolk, is one of the largest and most beautifully preserved Roman coin hoards ever found in Britain. A farmer named Eric Laws used a metal detector to search for a friend's lost hammer and found instead, buried about 18 inches below the surface of a field, a wooden chest that had long since rotted away, containing 14,865 gold and silver Roman coins, along with 200 gold, silver and ivory objects, spoons, pepper pots, jewellery, and a folding wooden table with silver fittings. The coins ranged in date from the reign of Magnus Maximus, 383 to 388 CE, to Honorius, 393 to 423 CE, placing the hoard's burial in the very last years of Roman Britain, when the legions were being withdrawn to defend Italy and the province was collapsing into chaos and uncertainty. Someone, perhaps a wealthy family of Romano-British landowners, gathered up their treasures in the face of an uncertain future and hid them in a field, planning to return. They never did. The Hoxton hoard is now at the British Museum, where the coins shine under museum lighting as brilliantly as they must have shone in a London villa nearly 1600 years ago. Every one of those 14,000 coins was handled by human hands, spent in human transactions, passed from merchant to soldier to taxpayer to farmer and back again through the circulation of daily life. Each one carries the residue of 100 small human moments, a loaf of bread bought, a debt paid, a wage earned, a prayer made. Let us speak of money and religion, because the relationship between money and the sacred is one of the oldest and most complex in human history. In virtually every ancient religion, temples were also economic institutions. The temples of Babylon and Nippur, as I mentioned, functioned as banks. The temples of ancient Egypt received enormous tax revenues in grain and other goods. The temples of Greece received offerings of coins and precious objects from worshippers seeking divine favour. The Jerusalem temple, one of the ancient world's greatest sacred sites, had its own currency, the temple shekel, required for payment of the temple tax, and the famous money changers in the temple courtyard were there to convert Roman imperial currency, which bore the image of the emperor forbidden in the temple, into the acceptable shekel. The money changers in the temple. You know the story. Jesus of Nazareth, arriving in Jerusalem, entering the temple courtyard and overturning the tables of the money changers, driving them out with a whip. It is one of the most dramatic scenes in the Gospels, and it is usually interpreted as a condemnation of the commercialization of sacred space. But there is more complexity here than simple condemnation. The money changers served a genuine function. Devout Jews coming to Jerusalem from across the Roman world, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from Asia Minor, from Rome itself, carried whatever currency was common in their home region. Roman denarii, Greek drachmas, Egyptian currencies. To pay the temple tax they needed shekels. The money changers provided that service. The rate of exchange and the fee charged for the service may well have been exploitative. There is evidence that the money-changing monopoly was controlled by the high priestly families who profited handsomely from it. It may have been this exploitation, rather than the commercial function itself, that drew Jesus' anger. The relationship between money and religion was not only conflictual. Medieval Christian churches received enormous revenues in the form of tithes, a tenth of a household's income, paid annually to the local church. This tithe was originally paid in kind, a tenth of the grain harvest, a tenth of the livestock. But as economies monetized, tithe payments became increasingly monetized as well. By the High Middle Ages, most tithes were paid in coin, and the resulting revenues funded the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals, the support of monastic communities, the maintenance of hospitals and schools. The Catholic Church was, in the Middle Ages, one of the largest and most sophisticated economic institutions in Europe, managing vast landholdings, collecting revenues from across the continent, conducting financial transactions through the network of the papal curia, and even, eventually, coming into conflict with national monarchies over the question of who could tax whom. The sale of indulgences, the practice of offering spiritual benefits in exchange for cash payments, was one of the most contentious financial practices of the late medieval church. An indulgence was a remission of temporal punishment for sins already forgiven in confession, in theory, a reduction in time spent in purgatory. The sale of indulgences was justified theologically, but was deeply controversial in practice, because it seemed to make salvation into a commercial transaction, available to the wealthy and denied to the poor. It was the aggressive marketing of indulgences by a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel in Germany in 1517. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, went his jingle. That provoked Martin Luther to post his famous 95 Theses challenging church teaching. The Protestant Reformation, one of the most consequential events in Western history, was sparked in part by a dispute about money and the commercialization of spiritual life. Money touches everything, even God. The history of money in America, in the United States, is its own long and fascinating story, a story of monetary chaos and order, of competing currencies and central banking, of gold rushes and paper wars. In the colonial period, the American colonies suffered from a persistent shortage of coins. Britain deliberately restricted the supply of specie to the colonies, forcing them to develop creative monetary alternatives. Massachusetts minted its own silver coins, the famous pine tree shilling, in the 1650s, a direct violation of English law. The colonies also used tobacco as money in the south, wampum, beaded shells, as money in the northeast, and a bewildering variety of foreign coins, Spanish pieces of 8, Dutch guilders, Portuguese medas. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued paper money, the Continental Dollar, to finance the war against Britain. Not worth a continental entered the American language as a phrase for worthless, because the continental dollar was indeed printed in such quantities that it collapsed to near zero value, decimating the savings of those who had accepted it. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 gave Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value, in part to prevent the kind of monetary chaos that had plagued the colonies and the early republic. The US Mint was established in Philadelphia in 1792, and the first American coins were struck the following year. The debate over money, specifically over whether the country should be on a gold standard, a silver standard, or both, dominated American politics for much of the 19th century. The bimetallic controversy, the greenback movement, the free silver campaign of the 1890s, these were not merely technical monetary debates. They were battles over who should control the money supply and in whose interests. Farmers and debtors generally favoured inflation, more money in circulation, easier to pay debts, while creditors and Eastern bankers favoured deflation and tight money. William Jennings, Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention was, at its core, a protest against the suffering that tight money and the gold standard were inflicting on ordinary working people. The Federal Reserve System was established in 1913, creating for the first time a central bank with the authority to manage the money supply and serve as a lender of last resort to the banking system. The Fed, as it is universally known, is one of the most powerful and controversial institutions in the world. Its decisions about interest rates and money supply affect the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, and it was created ultimately in response to the same fundamental challenge that has always faced monetary systems: how to maintain trust and stability in a system that depends on both. And now it is getting very late. The night has deepened around us. The stars have moved in their slow arc across the sky. The fire, wherever it is, wherever you are imagining it, has burned lower, and the light is gentler now, amber and soft. We have travelled a very long way tonight. From the barley fields of ancient Mesopotamia, through the gleaming workshops of Lydia, across the great trading routes of the ancient world, through the markets of Athens and Rome, to the paper money of Song dynasty China, the banking halls of Renaissance Florence, the silver mines of Potosi, the stock exchange of Amsterdam, and all the way forward to the digital currencies of our own age. And through all of this, one thread has remained constant. One story has been playing quietly, underneath all the others. It is the story of trust. Money as trust, made physical, made portable, made storable and divisible and universally recognizable. From the first Lydian coin with its stamped lion's head, "This is real," the king says, and you can trust it, to the digital balance in your bank account, every form of money has been, at its heart, a form of collective trust. Trust in the king, trust in the government, trust in the bank, trust in the system, trust in each other. That trust has been abused, over and over again, by kings who debased their coins, by governments that printed too much paper money, by banks that lent recklessly and failed catastrophically. The history of money is also the history of monetary crises and monetary failures, of the terrible consequences when trust breaks down. But it has also, more often than not, held. The trust has held. The money has worked. The markets have opened in the morning and closed in the evening, and strangers have exchanged goods and labour for small tokens of value, and somehow, remarkably, civilization has continued. That is the quiet miracle at the heart of this story. The miracle is not the gold or the silver or the paper or the digital record. The miracle is us, the human beings who, over thousands of years have agreed and continued to agree and kept on agreeing to trust the small tokens in each other's hands, let us return for a while to the ancient world of daily commerce, and let us be more specific this time. Let us slow down even further and really inhabit the texture of it. In 5th century Athens, a citizen waking before dawn would typically begin his day without coffee or tea. Those consolations were unknown to ancient Greeks, but perhaps with a crust of bread and some diluted wine, eaten quickly before heading out to the day's work. The city was already stirring at that hour. The farmers from the countryside beyond the walls arrived at the city gates before sunrise, loading their carts and donkeys, eager to claim good positions in the agora before the prime selling hours of late morning and noon. The agora of Athens was not a single building but an open space, roughly rectangular, surrounded by colonnaded buildings, the Stoa of Zeus, the royal stoa, the painted stoa, various other covered walkways, under which sellers could shelter from sun and rain. The open central space was divided informally into sections by the type of goods sold. The fish market, which operated only in the morning because fish spoiled quickly, the vegetable section, the grain dealers, the olive oil merchants, the pottery stalls, the cloth sellers, the shoemakers. Each section had a name in Greek, and the word for market in general, agora, was also used in phrases like to go agora-ing, meaning simply to do one's shopping. Shopping was a social act in ancient Athens, not merely a commercial one. Men of leisure went to the agora not just to buy things but to talk, to argue politics, to hear the latest news, to encounter friends and enemies. Socrates famously haunted the agora, stopping strangers to ask them probing questions about virtue and knowledge. But beneath all this philosophical and social activity, the commercial machinery hummed. Coins changed hands thousands of times a day. The trapezitai, the money changers and bankers, sat at their stone tables at the edge of the agora, ready to exchange foreign currencies, make loans, take deposits, and count the endless stream of coins that flowed through the city's hands. The obol begins the day in the purse of a fisherman from the port of Piraeus, 8 miles from Athens, who has just sold a load of fresh sea bass to an Athens merchant for 2 drachmas. He pockets the 12 obols he has received in change, since the merchant had only drachmas and needed to make change, and prepares to head home. But first he stops at a sausage seller's stall near the fish market. He is hungry from the early morning work of hauling in the nets and transporting his catch to the city. He pays 1 obol for a small sausage, grilled on a charcoal brazier, fragrant with cumin and garlic. The sausage seller, who goes by the name Sosias, and who's been working this corner of the agora for 20 years, pockets the obol. Later that morning, he uses it to pay the water carrier who fills his large terracotta storage jar with fresh water from one of the city's public fountains. Clean water in Athens was freely available at public fountains fed by aqueducts, but many people preferred to pay a small fee to have it carried to them rather than hauling it themselves. The water carrier, a slave as it happens, owned by a wealthy merchant who hires him out by the day and keeps most of the proceeds, is allowed to keep a small percentage of his daily earnings. The obol goes into the small clay pot he keeps hidden in his sleeping quarters. By evening, the water carrier has saved enough to buy a small clay lamp and a small quantity of olive oil, which he needs to extend his working hours into the evening. He purchases them from a potter and an oil merchant in the lower agora. The obol passes to the oil merchant. The oil merchant that evening pays the obol to a woman who has agreed to watch his stall for an hour while he attends to some personal business. The woman, freeborn, a widow, making ends meet through a combination of small wages and the rental income from a single apartment she owns in a crowded neighbourhood near the Potter's Quarter, takes the obol home. The next morning she uses it to pay a portion of her contribution to a neighbourhood religious observance. A small fund collected to pay for the sacrifice of a lamb at a local shrine to Hecate, goddess of the crossroads. The money goes into a terracotta jar kept by the organiser of the observance, a prosperous craftsman. 1 obol, 1 small coin, 1 day, at least 6 hands, each exchange small, each one unremarkable to the participants, each one a tiny thread in the enormous invisible web of Athenian economic life. This is what money does, day after day, hour after hour, without ceremony or drama. It connects, it moves, it carries value, and with it, the invisible energy of human labour and need, from hand to hand, from life to life, keeping the whole vast complicated machine of civilization running. Across the North Sea, far from the warm marble colonnades of the Athenian agora, the Norse world of the 8th through 11th centuries CE had its own fascinating relationship with silver and money, a relationship that was in some ways more ancient, more raw, more direct than the sophisticated coin economies of the Mediterranean South. The Vikings, those brilliant, violent, wide-ranging Scandinavian raiders and traders, operated primarily what historians call bullion economy, or a hack silver economy. They did use coins, certainly. They encountered them everywhere they went, from the silver pennies of England to the dirhams of the Islamic caliphates. But in the Norse world of that era, coins were valued primarily by weight, not by denomination. This meant that Viking silver was often cut. A Norse merchant completing a transaction might literally hack a piece off a silver arm ring, or cut a coin in half, to make the weight work out to the agreed amount. The resulting pieces, irregular jagged fragments of silver, are called hack silver, and they've been found in Viking Age hoards across Scandinavia, northern Britain, Russia, and the Baltic. The silver arm ring, a thick, coiled band of silver worn on the forearm, was simultaneously jewellery, a display of wealth, and a reserve of currency. A wealthy Norse chieftain might wear several of these rings, each one representing a significant quantity of silver that could be cut and spent as needed. The rings were often deliberately made in sizes corresponding to rough monetary units, so that cutting off a specific segment would yield a predictable weight of silver. The great Viking treasure hoards that have been found across northern Europe, from the Spillings hoard in Sweden, the largest Viking Age silver hoard ever found, containing more than 65 kilograms of silver, to the many smaller hoards of Britain and Ireland, tell us about a society that was deeply, urgently engaged with silver, that accumulated it in vast quantities through raiding and trading, and that kept it close and personal in a way that the abstract money of the Mediterranean world did not. The silver that fueled the Viking economy came from many sources, but one of the most important was the Islamic world. The silver dirhams of the Abbasid Caliphate, struck in the great mints of Baghdad and Samarkand, each one bearing beautiful calligraphic Arabic inscriptions from the Quran, flowed northward in enormous quantities along the Volga River trade route, exchanged for the furs and slaves and honey and amber that Viking traders brought south from the forests of Russia. The number of Islamic dirhams found in Swedish hoards is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of coins, representing a flow of silver northward from the Islamic world that lasted for over a century and that transformed the economy of Scandinavia. Arab silver built Viking ships. Arab dirhams, melted down and recast, became the arm rings that became hack silver that flowed back into commerce in 1,000 small transactions across the Norse world. The connection between the silk-robed scholars of Baghdad and the fur-clad warriors of Scandinavia, mediated by silver coins, is one of the most unlikely and arresting stories in all of monetary history. And since we have followed the dirhams north, let us now follow their origins south and turn our attention, with the gentle attention that this late hour deserves, to the remarkable monetary civilization of the Islamic world. The Arabic dirham and the gold dinar, the two coins that were the backbone of Islamic monetary systems from the 7th century CE onward, were among the finest and most beautiful coins ever struck. And they were something more than that. They were theological statements. The first Islamic coins, in the earliest years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, were actually adaptations of existing Byzantine and Persian coins, with crosses replaced by Arabic inscriptions and royal portraits, forbidden by Islamic tradition as potentially idolatrous, eventually replaced by calligraphic texts. The process of Islamicizing the coinage was gradual, completed by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, who in 696 to 698 CE introduced a revolutionary new coin, a purely epigraphic coin, bearing no images at all, only beautiful Arabic calligraphy. The Umayyad reform coins bore on one face the Shahada, the Muslim declaration of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And on the other face a text from the Quran. They were coins as prayer, coins as theological proclamation, coins as a visible embodiment of the new Islamic civilization that was spreading with astonishing speed across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into Europe. The calligraphy on Islamic coins was not merely functional, it was an art form in itself. In a civilization that rejected figurative representation in sacred contexts, writing became the supreme visual art, and the coins were among the most widely distributed canvases for that art. Every dirham that passed through a Muslim merchant's hands was a tiny page of sacred text, a reminder of faith in the most mundane of everyday transactions. The Islamic world of the 8th through 13th centuries, the Great Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, the Umayyad Caliphate in Spain, and the various smaller dynasties that coexisted and competed across this vast region, was one of the most economically sophisticated and commercially active civilizations in the world. The Arabic language served as a common medium of commerce across a vast area. The dirham and dinar circulated widely and reliably, and the Muslim merchants who travelled the trade routes of the Indian Ocean and the Silk Road were among the most experienced, best-travelled, and commercially sophisticated people on earth. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveller of the 14th century, travelled over 117,000 kilometres across the known world, from Morocco to Mali, from Turkey to India, from Central Asia to China. And everywhere he went, he found the infrastructure of Islamic commerce. Merchant lodges, money changers who could exchange his Moroccan dirhams for local currency, credit networks that allowed value to be transferred without physical movement of coin. The Islamic world of the 14th century had created something approaching a functioning international monetary system, centuries before Europe managed anything similar. The strangest episode in the history of paper money, stranger even than the Chinese experiments, is surely the story of John Law and the Mississippi Bubble. John Law was a Scottish financier, gambler, and economic theorist who, in 1716, persuaded the French government to let him establish a private bank with the power to issue paper money. France in 1716 was in desperate financial straits, groaning under the debts accumulated by the wars of Louis XIV, and the young regent Philippe d'Orléans was willing to try almost anything. Law's theory was, in its essentials, correct. The French economy was being strangled by a shortage of circulating money. The solution was paper money, banknotes backed not by precious metal, but by the productive capacity of the French state and its colonies. By increasing the money supply, Law reasoned, you could stimulate economic activity, create employment, generate tax revenues, and solve the debt problem. For a while, the theory seemed to work brilliantly. The Banque Royale, as Law's bank became, issued paper notes. Economic activity increased. The Mississippi Company, which Law controlled and which held a monopoly on trade with France's vast North American territories, saw its share price soar. Investors who bought shares early made fortunes overnight. A new word entered the French language, millionaire, from the million livres that some investors accumulated. And then it collapsed. The share prices could not keep rising forever. Some smart investors began to cash out, exchanging their shares and banknotes for gold and silver. Others followed. Then came a stampede. Law's system, built on paper promises backed by future colonial profits that had never materialized, could not withstand the pressure. The Mississippi Company's shares fell to near zero. The banknotes became worthless. Thousands of investors were ruined. The disaster left such a deep scar on the French financial psyche that France would not establish a proper central bank, the Banque de France, until 1800, nearly a century later. And the word banque became so associated in French minds with failure and fraud that the institution was called the Banque de France rather than the Banque Royale, partly to distance it from the memory of Law's catastrophe. Law himself, brilliant, flawed, genuinely innovative, ultimately disastrous, fled France in disgrace and died in poverty in Venice in 1729. His ghost haunts the history of monetary economics, a reminder that good ideas, badly executed, can cause tremendous damage. January 24, 1848. Coloma, California. A carpenter named James Marshall is inspecting a newly constructed sawmill along the American River, owned by John Sutter. The water is running swiftly in the mill race, the channel that carries water to drive the mill wheel, and something catches Marshall's eye. A small, yellowish glint in the gravel. He bends down, picks it up, tests it, bites it, pounds it with a rock, watches how it behaves in water. Gold. Pure, unmistakable gold. What followed was one of the most dramatic economic events in American history. Within a year, more than 100,000 people from across the United States and the world had made their way to California, by sea around Cape Horn, across the Isthmus of Panama, overland across the Great Plains in the Sierra Nevada, all of them chasing the golden dream that Marshall's discovery had ignited. The 49ers, as the gold rush miners of 1849 are known, were a remarkably diverse group. Americans from the East, yes, but also Mexicans, Chileans, Australians, Chinese, who formed a substantial and often victimized minority, Europeans of every nation, free and enslaved Black Americans, Native Americans whose lives were being catastrophically disrupted by the influx. What they found when they arrived was a world turned upside down by gold. Prices were extraordinary. A pair of boots might cost $100 in gold dust, a meal $10, a night's lodging $5. In a world where most American workers earned perhaps $1 a day, these prices were shocking. But gold was plentiful, and so the prices made sense in the strange new gold economy of the California mining camps. Gold dust and nuggets served as currency in the camps, weighed out on small scales for every transaction, just as Mesopotamian silver had been weighed 4,000 years earlier. The problem was the same: inconsistency, dispute, the endless friction of a commodity money without standardized units. Merchants quickly learned to keep one thumb on the scale when weighing customers' gold. The US Mint eventually established a branch in San Francisco to solve the problem, converting raw gold into standard coins that could circulate reliably. But in the interim years of the early gold rush, miners and merchants improvised with gold dust, private mints, and a bewildering variety of private gold tokens struck by San Francisco banking houses. The social effects of the gold rush were enormous and complex. It accelerated California's statehood, admitted in 1850 under the Compromise of that year. It fueled massive infrastructure development: railroads, telegraph lines, banks, towns. It created enormous wealth for some and heartbreak and poverty for many others, since most miners made modest wages at best from their back-breaking work. It contributed to the displacement and decimation of California's Native American populations, and it poured enormous quantities of gold into the global economy at precisely the moment when the gold standard was becoming the dominant international monetary framework. The California gold, followed shortly after by Australian gold in the 1850s, significantly increased the global money supply and contributed to a period of economic expansion and mild inflation. In the language of monetary economics, gold discoveries in the mid-19th century served the same function that quantitative easing serves today. They increased the money supply, lowered the effective interest rate, and stimulated economic activity. There is a field of historical study called numismatics, the study of coins, that is one of the most intimate and rewarding ways to encounter the ancient world. Numismatists are, in a sense, time travelers. They hold in their hands objects that were touched by people 2, 5, 25 centuries ago. They read the stories that those objects carry, not just in their images and inscriptions, but in their wear patterns, their surviving finishes, the evidence of how they were used. A worn coin tells one story. This coin circulated widely, passed through many hands, served its monetary function for years or decades. A fresh, mint-state coin tells another. This coin was perhaps set aside immediately, perhaps chosen from a mint for a gift or an offering, never used in ordinary commerce. The die marks on ancient coins, small variations in the impression that allow numismatists to identify which specific pair of dies struck a particular coin, can be used to reconstruct the organization and output of ancient mints. By counting the number of different dies represented in a population of coins and applying statistical reasoning, scholars can estimate how many coins were originally produced. These estimates have been used to reconstruct ancient military campaigns, which required large coin outputs to pay soldiers, economic booms and busts reflected in rising or falling mint output, and political history. The dies used in different cities tell us about political authority and its spread. The images on coins are equally eloquent. When a new emperor came to power in Rome, old coins with the previous emperor's portrait were sometimes disfigured, the face obliterated, the portrait scratched out. This was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, and the coins that survive with their faces destroyed are vivid evidence of political violence made miniature. Conversely, the careful, detailed portraits on some ancient coins, particularly the Hellenistic coins struck after Alexander's death by his successors, are among the finest portraits we have of those individuals. Coinage was one of the primary forms of visual self-representation available to ancient rulers, and the finest die cutters were employed to produce images that would project power, dignity, and authority to every corner of the realm. In 33 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, the Roman Empire experienced what may have been the world's first properly documented banking crisis, a credit contraction and financial panic that crippled the Roman financial system and required an extraordinary government bailout. The details, preserved mainly by the historian Tacitus, are both fascinating and remarkably familiar to modern readers. The crisis began with the strictly enforced application of an old law, requiring that a certain proportion of lenders' capital be held in Italian land, a rule that forced bankers and creditors to call in loans and liquidate investments. This sudden contraction of credit sent the money market into panic. Interest rates spiked. Debtors who had borrowed against the value of land found that land prices had crashed because everyone was trying to sell simultaneously. Banks began to fail. Tacitus describes the crisis with telling detail. A dearth of money caused all landed property to tumble in value. Every debtor was distressed, and as all sales were stopped, wails went up throughout the whole of Italy. The Roman banking system, it turns out, ran on credit, on confidence, on the expectation that loans would be repaid and deposits were safe, exactly as modern banking does. When that confidence collapsed, the entire system froze. Tiberius's response was also strikingly modern. He provided emergency loans from the imperial treasury, some accounts say 100 million sestertii, to be lent to distressed borrowers at zero interest for 3 years against the security of land at double its value. This was essentially a quantitative easing program, a government injection of liquidity into a frozen financial system. It worked after a fashion. The panic subsided. The credit markets eventually unfroze. But the episode shows how sophisticated and how fragile the Roman financial system had become. It would be wrong to leave the history of money without pausing to reflect on what the great thinkers of the ancient world made of it. Because money troubled the philosophers, troubled them deeply, persistently, in ways that modern economists might not always appreciate. Aristotle, in his Politics, drew a distinction that has shaped economic thought ever since. He distinguished between 2 kinds of wealth-getting: oikonomia, the management of the household and the community, aimed at satisfying genuine needs and achieving a good life, and trematistic, the art of wealth acquisition for its own sake, aimed not at sufficiency but at unlimited accumulation. Oikonomia, from which our word economy derives, was, in Aristotle's view, natural and necessary and good. Communities needed to provide for themselves. Families needed to be sustained. Surplus goods could properly be traded for things that were lacking. This was the proper role of exchange, and money, properly used, served this proper role. But schematistic, the pursuit of money as an end in itself, the desire for unlimited accumulation, was, Aristotle thought, deeply unnatural and potentially destructive. Money was sterile. It could not grow the way plants and animals grow. The love of money for its own sake was a perversion of the proper human relationship to wealth, a substitution of means for ends, a confusion of the symbol with the thing it represented. Aristotle's critique has echoed through the centuries. Thomas Aquinas incorporated it into Christian theology. Karl Marx gave it a secular, materialist form in his critique of capitalism. The contemporary debate about financialization, the tendency of modern economies to produce more and more economic activity in the financial sector rather than in the production of goods and services, is, at its core, an Aristotelian debate, and yet the countervailing tradition is equally strong. Adam Smith, writing in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, saw the market and the monetary exchange that made the market possible as a powerful engine of human welfare, one that harnessed individual self-interest in service of collective prosperity. The butcher, the brewer, the baker provide our dinner not from benevolence, but from regard to their own interest, and yet we are fed. Money, in Smith's vision, was not a source of corruption but a tool of social coordination, one that allowed the specialized labor of millions of individuals to combine into the enormous productive capacity of a modern economy. Both traditions are, in their way, correct. Money is a tool, and tools can be used well or badly. The hammer that builds a house is the same hammer that can break a skull. Money that facilitates exchange and enables specialization and creates genuine wealth is a different thing from money that becomes the object of obsessive accumulation, the engine of exploitation, the measure of all human worth. The ancient debate has not been resolved. It continues, and it will continue, as long as human beings live together and need to exchange the products of their labor. I want to take you back one more time to the sensory world of ancient commerce, because history is not only ideas and events, it is also textures and sounds and smells, and the small physical details of lives lived in bodies in the physical world. What did it feel like to hold an ancient coin? The Athenian owl, the silver tetradrachm, was about the size of a modern quarter, perhaps slightly thicker. The silver was fine, almost pure, with the slightly satiny texture of high-quality metal. On the obverse, the face of Athena was rendered in crisp, high relief. You could feel the contours of the helmet, the eye, the neck, the hair with your thumb. On the reverse, the owl stood in even higher relief, the feathers of its body rendered in tiny detail, the large circular eye a deep, perfectly round depression. To hold an Athenian owl in your hand was to hold, at the same time, a small functional tool and a small work of art. The coin was beautiful, not ornamentally beautiful in the way of a brooch or a ring, but purposefully beautiful in the way that a perfectly made tool is beautiful. Every detail served a purpose. The high relief made the design easily recognizable by touch. The consistent weight made it trustworthy. The fine purity made it valuable. Roman coins had a different feel. The Republic-era silver denarius was thin and broad, with a slightly rough, irregular surface, the results of a hand-striking process that was faster and higher volume than the careful Athenian work. By the imperial period, the denarius had become thicker and more uniform, struck with greater mechanical precision. The bronze sestertius, large and heavy, the everyday coin of Roman commerce, had satisfying heft to it, clunking solidly into your palm. You could feel the weight of Rome's economic power in a handful of sestertii. Chinese bronze cash coins, the round coins with the square holes, had a distinctive sound that became one of the defining sensory experiences of Chinese commercial life for 2,000 years. The coins were relatively flat and thin, made of a bronze alloy that produced a bright, clear ring when struck together. The sound of coins being counted, the rapid clicking of bronze on bronze, the sorting and stacking in the hands of an experienced merchant, was as familiar to a Chinese market-goer as the smell of street food or the calls of vendors. Medieval European coins were often more roughly made than their ancient predecessors. The hand-hammering technique that produced them was the same in principle as that of ancient mints, but the dies were often less finely engraved, the blanks less carefully prepared, the striking less precise. The result was coins that were irregular in shape, often more oval than round, with lettering that ran off the edge, with designs that were off-centre or doubled from a misaligned die strike. These imperfections tell us something. They tell us that medieval mints were often underfunded, understaffed, and under pressure to produce large quantities of coins quickly. They tell us that the die cutters and mint workers were often artisans of modest skill rather than the master engravers of the Athenian or Augustan mints. And they remind us that the history of money is not a story of steady progress toward perfection, but a story of ups and downs, of periods of sophisticated artistry and periods of crude functionality, reflecting the broader rhythms of economic and political life. One more story, told softly, before we approach the end. In the markets of many cultures, the counting of money was accompanied by a kind of verbal ritual, a counting out, a public declaration, a spoken guarantee that matched the physical transfer of coin. In the markets of medieval Islamic cities, the weighing of gold coins was often witnessed by witnesses who would testify to the fairness of the transaction if disputes arose later. In ancient Babylon, the scribes who recorded silver transactions in cuneiform were the witnesses of the monetary system, their clay tablets the memory of an institution that had no other way to store its commitments. Trust in economies without reliable third-party institutions, without courts that efficiently enforced contracts, without banks that reliably kept deposits, without regulatory bodies that guaranteed honest weights and measures. Trust had to be personal. It had to be built over time through repeated interaction, through reputation, through the social network of the community. This is why merchants in pre-modern societies so often traded along ethnic or religious or family lines. Jewish merchants traded preferentially with other Jewish merchants, not because of clannishness, but because the religious community provided an enforcement mechanism for commercial trust, a way of punishing cheaters and rewarding honest dealers that operated outside and independent of the often corrupt or inaccessible formal legal system. Similar patterns have been documented among Armenian merchants, Chinese merchant networks, Quaker traders in early modern England. The emergence of reliable third-party institutions, trustworthy courts, honest regulatory bodies, effective central banks, gradually made it possible to extend commercial trust beyond community lines, to trade with strangers who shared no ethnic or religious or family bond, relying on the institution rather than the personal relationship. This is what the rule of law means, in economic terms. It means that you can trust a stranger because you share the same institutional framework, the same courts, the same regulatory system, the same monetary authority. Money is the symbol of that trust. The law is its enforcer, and the combination of money and law is one of the most powerful forces for human cooperation and prosperity ever invented. Sometimes, when I think about the history of money, I find myself thinking about weight. Not the physical weight of metal, though that matters too, but the weight of time. Think about this. A Roman silver denarius struck in the reign of Augustus Caesar about 2,000 years ago was made from silver that was mined, perhaps, in Spain or in Asia Minor. That silver began as ore deep in the earth. It was extracted by the labour of men and women whose names we will never know. Purified and refined in furnaces that no longer exist, minted into a coin in a workshop that has been rubble for 18 centuries. That coin circulated. It passed through hundreds, perhaps thousands of hands during its active life. Soldiers, merchants, farmers, slaves, children, emperors, beggars. It may have been melted down and reminted, its silver given a new form and a new face, or it may have been lost, dropped in a market, dropped in a field, tucked into a hiding place and never recovered. Eventually it went into the earth, and then, one day, perhaps yesterday, perhaps 500 years ago, perhaps tomorrow, it came out of the earth again. A farmer's plough, a construction worker's spade, an archaeologist's brush. The coin came back into the light, still bearing the face of its emperor, still carrying the weight of its silver, still, if you held it up and looked at it carefully, telling its story. 2,000 years, the span of every human life since the coin was made, laid end to end. The rise and fall of empires, the birth of religions, the invention of printing and gunpowder and steam engines and airplanes and computers. All of that time, and here is this small disk of silver, patient and mute, carrying its story of one moment in the reign of one emperor in one corner of one empire. If you held it in your hand right now, you would feel the same weight that Augustus's soldiers felt, the same density, the same slight give between your fingers, the same faint roughness of the silver surface. The coin is a time machine, not a dramatic one. It does not transport you anywhere, but it reaches across the centuries and touches you physically with the past. This is part of why coins matter, part of why numismatists devote their lives to studying them, part of why museum visitors pause longest over the cases of ancient coins, those small discs under glass. They are relics of human life, preserved by the durability of metal, carrying in their images and their weights and their wear patterns the memory of millions of small human moments. Money is one of the ways we reach across time. It is one of the ways we leave traces of ourselves that survive. The merchant who lost that obol in an Athenian market 2,500 years ago did not know he was leaving a message for the future. He was just buying a fish. But the coin survived, and now we have it, and through it, in some small way, we have him. Let me try to say something true about money. Something that cuts through all the complexity and history and reaches the still centre of the thing. Money is a story we tell together. It is a collective narrative, agreed upon, maintained, and renewed in every transaction, every day, everywhere in the world. The paper note or digital number that represents a dollar or a euro or a yuan or a rupee is not, in itself, anything. It is just paper, just pixels, just digits in a database. It has no inherent value. A dollar bill cannot be eaten, cannot shelter you from rain, cannot warm you on a cold night. It is nothing, except that we all agree it is something, and in that agreement, in the millions of tiny daily acts of acceptance and trust that constitute the money system, it becomes real. It becomes genuinely and functionally worth something, worth the breakfast you buy with it, the rent you pay with it, the labour you sell for it. The story of money is the story of how human beings learn to create value through agreement, how we discovered that we could build shared systems of trust that were more powerful than any individual's resources, how we found that the collective imagination, the ability to all agree together that this small disk of metal or this piece of paper represents real value, was one of the most productive forces in human civilization. That discovery, made independently in Lydia and China and India and the Americas and everywhere else that complex human societies arose, is one of the great achievements of our species. Not a scientific achievement or an artistic one, but a social one. An achievement of collective trust and collective imagination, and it continues every day. Every time you use money, every time you accept that a price means something, that your wages are worth something, that your savings will still be worth something tomorrow, you are participating in one of the oldest, largest, and most important collective agreements in the history of the human race. before I let you go fully into the arms of sleep, I want to sit with you for just a few more quiet minutes, because there is something I have been circling around all night, something I want to say plainly, gently, before the music fades and the darkness deepens. We talk about history as if it were made by the large, by empires and armies, by kings and conquerors, by great inventions and terrible wars, and all of those things are real. All of those things shaped the world we live in. But tonight we've been following something small, a coin, a disc of metal that fits in the palm of a child's hand. We have been following it across 6,000 years and across every inhabited continent on Earth, and we have found that this small thing, this apparently trivial, mundane, utterly ordinary object, was at the centre of everything. It was at the centre of the rise of cities, because cities require markets, and markets require money. It was at the centre of the growth of empires, because empires require tax systems and paid armies, and tax systems and paid armies require money. It was at the centre of the development of art and architecture and philosophy, because all of those things require surplus, the ability to free some people from daily subsistence labour. And surplus requires the economic organisation that money makes possible. The Parthenon was built with silver. The Colosseum was built with the profits of conquest, converted into coin, and spent on labour and marble. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built with tithes collected in coin. The voyages of Columbus were financed by Spanish gold. The scientific revolution was funded by the commercial prosperity of early modern Europe's market economies. The Industrial Revolution was driven by the accumulation and investment of capital, money, generating more money in service of the transformation of the world. All of it connected back to that small stamped disc. All of it rooted in the ancient idea, the revolutionary, world-changing, quietly extraordinary idea that a piece of metal stamped with a king's image and guaranteed by a king's authority could carry value reliably from hand to hand, from city to city, from century to century. We do not think about this. We never think about this. We carry our phones and tap our cards and check our bank balances and participate in the most sophisticated monetary system in the history of the world without a moment's reflection on how any of it came to be, on the thousands of years of human ingenuity and failure and adaptation and creativity that made it possible. But tonight, for a few hours, we have thought about it together. We have walked through the ancient markets. We have held the coins in our imaginary hands. We have listened to the sound of silver on silver and copper on copper, and the quiet scratch of a stylus recording a transaction in wet clay. And I genuinely hope, that when you wake tomorrow and you reach into your pocket or your purse or your wallet and touch whatever form your money takes today, something of this night will come back to you. Some small echo of the long, slow, remarkable story you've been carrying with you, without knowing it, your entire life. If you woke tomorrow in a world without money, without any shared medium of exchange, without any system of trusted transferable value, the complexity of the life you live would be impossible. The food you eat would have to be grown by your own hands or traded directly with farmers you knew personally. The clothes you wear would have to be sewn by you or bartered from a weaver in your immediate community. The house you live in, the roads you travel, the electricity that powers the device through which you are hearing this voice, all of it impossible. All of it dependent at some level on the systems of money and exchange and trust that have been building layer by layer for 6,000 years. We sometimes speak of money as though it were a problem, and it is sometimes a problem, when it is concentrated in too few hands, when it distorts values, when the love of it corrupts. The ancient philosophers were not wrong to worry about those things. The modern critics of financial capitalism are not wrong to point out its failures and its cruelties. But money itself, the underlying idea, the social technology, the collective agreement to trust and exchange, that is not a problem. That is one of the greatest solutions the human mind has ever devised. It is the solution to the problem of strangers, the solution to the problem of distance, the solution to the problem of time, how to store value, how to defer consumption, how to invest in a future that does not yet exist. It is the solution, imperfect and contested and eternally in need of reform, to the ancient challenge of how human beings who do not know each other can cooperate productively to their mutual benefit in a world that is too large and too complex for any individual to navigate alone. That is the history of money. That is the story of coins. That is what we have been quietly celebrating tonight, in the soft dark, in the stillness of this hour. The extraordinary human gift of trust. The extraordinary human capacity to build something larger than any individual, something that lives in the space between us, in the agreements we make and keep and renew, something as small as a coin, something as large as civilization. Sleep well, dear listener. The coins are quiet tonight. The night is yours, and you are held gently in the long embrace of history. Good night.